Chapter 1599. Fawn color equals red, squinting eyes face. B. The many living beings who had just been enlightened by the Gui Shou naturally made great progress in these 9 days. This allowed them to truly establish the concept of cultivation, allowing them to gradually control their innate abilities. They began to develop countless methods that exceeded their original abilities according to their own conditions and abilities. In this way, in less than 10 days, their strength had increased by several times compared to before. Moreover, not only had their strength increased, but their control over their own strength had also reached a level that was several times stronger than before. The specific manifestation was that if they wanted to kill a living being before, there was a great possibility that a large area around the living being would be destroyed at the same time due to the leakage of power. But now this was not the case. Now they could only kill whatever they wanted to kill. There would not be many battle aftershocks that would damage the surroundings. The many living beings had such great gains, and the cultivators who belonged to this civilized country who listened to the Gui Shou's Tao preaching also had great gains. After all, listening to the Gui Shou's Tao preaching once was obviously not enough for them to completely grasp the various principles that the Gui Shou preached. Relatively speaking, listening to the Gui Shou's Tao preaching again was not as detailed as the last time, but it was enough for them to comprehend it again. Thus, they could solve the various problems that they encountered last time, allowing them to comprehend more mysteries from the principles that the Gui Shou preached. After 9 days, when the Gui Shou stopped preaching, the many cultivators all bowed to the Gui Shou with great gratitude. They were already very grateful to listen to the Gui Shou preaching once, but now the Gui Shou actually preached twice. It was self-evident how much care he had for them. The Gui Shou did not pay attention to their understanding. Just like before, he casually pointed out 2 of the living beings he enlightened and directly announced to the many living beings that they were the guardian divine beasts of this country. He asked them to worship them and also asked them to protect this civilized country. The living beings who were enlightened by the Gui Shou had an inexplicable childlike affection for the Gui Shou. They almost did not ask the reason for the Gui Shou's orders, nor did they ask what benefits it would bring them. They had already agreed. As for the cultivators of the civilized nations, they were even more grateful and immediately greeted the guardian divine beast of the kingdom. After busying himself for a while, he decided on his identity. As a result, the 2 of them instantly sensed that their connection with heaven and earth seemed to have changed. With this improvement, he instantly understood Gui Shou's intention of making such arrangements. He could not help but feel even more grateful to Gui Shou. Seeing that everything had been arranged, Gui Shou was no longer in the mood to stay here. He immediately sent the cultivators in the civilized countries back to where they came from, and he wanted to continue to another civilized country with the thousands of living beings that he had enlightened. Just as he was about to move, he suddenly sensed something and let out a soft cry. With a wave of his hand, an inexplicable power descended from an inexplicable place, directly forming a void concept cage in front of him. It blasted towards the void in front of it. At this moment, a shrill shriek rang out from the void ahead. Soon after, the air trembled, and an incredibly powerful force erupted from above. This force was so strong that it even completely crushed the strange existence that Gui Shou had constructed. It even instantly destroyed the island that Gui Shou and the others were on. In the blink of an eye, only the small part of the island that Gui Shou and the others were standing on was still intact. "You actually dared to peep, come out!" Gui Shou coldly shouted. As he shouted coldly, the concept cage of nothingness he had sent out rotated slightly and suddenly produced a strange power that sucked in the place where the impact came from. In an instant, an extremely powerful existence descended from the void. It was a living being. It looked like a human but was a bit strange. It was only half the height of a human, and its eyes flickered with a strong light of wisdom. This living being was bleeding all over, and its power surged frantically, doing its best to resist the invasion of the void concept cage around it. From this, it could be seen how powerful this living being was. Without using the power that was summoned and guided from an unknown place, it could resist the invasion of the void concept cage with just its own power. Even if Luo Fan saw this, he would not be able to help but exclaim in admiration. At this moment, this living being was full of panic, and it said, "Creator, spare me, Creator." Gui Shou frowned and said, "Who are you? Why do you call me Creator?" Hearing this, the living being's eyes were filled with confusion, and it said, "I don't know what I am. Aren't you called Creator?" Hearing this, Gui Shou frowned even more deeply. He did not sense his own aura from this living being at all. He was sure that this living being had absolutely nothing to do with him, and it was definitely not created by him. "Answer me seriously. Why are you hiding at the side? Do you have bad intentions?" No. I'm just listening to the Tao. It's just that I can't find the way, that's why I'm hiding here. I don't have evil intentions. This creature cried out in panic. Gui Shou's eyes flashed with understanding. With a slight thought, the void concept cage stopped crushing and eroding it, but it did not disappear completely. Instead, it directly hid in his body, ready to be released at any time. Although this living being seemed to be only a little stronger than the living beings he had enlightened, and it did not seem to be much of a threat to him, it was, after all, a living being of unknown origin and identity. It was never wrong to be careful. After putting away the void concept cage, he casually waved his hand. With a wave of his hand, the destroyed island reappeared, and the layer of strange existence between the normal space-time and the ineffable place was instantly regenerated. Everything looked exactly the same as before. After everything was restored, he said, "Come here and tell me where you came from." The living being was very obedient. Hearing Gui Shou's words, it came not far from Gui Shou, bowed down, and said, "I don't know where I came from. When I was conscious, I was already listening to the voice of my Creator. This voice led me and made me follow the voice in a daze for hundreds of years. Until just now, I suddenly woke up as if I had just woken up from a dream. I got rid of that dazed state and came here." Hearing this, Gui Shou could not help but be more curious. The origin of this living being was beyond his imagination. He originally thought that something had been attracted by his sermon, but it turned out that it was a creature near this kingdom. He did not expect that he had only guessed part of it correctly. This creature was indeed attracted by his sermon, but it was not a creature near this kingdom. Instead, it might be a creature near the kingdom he had been in thousands of times before he had given his sermon. It might even be a living being stimulated by his preaching. After that, it just chased after him in a daze and kept moving with him. It kept going around one country after another. From this aspect, it did not seem inappropriate for it to call itself a creator. As for whether this living being was lying or not, after going to so many civilized countries and seeing so many living beings, Gui Shou believed that he could see it clearly. "Since you were born for my preaching, then follow me from now on." "From now on, follow me," Gui Shou said after making up his mind. Hearing this, the living being could not help but be overjoyed and said, "Thank you, Creator, for your help." Gui Shou nodded, then frowned and said, "You must have wanted to condense the innate Tao constitution but couldn't find a template, so you condensed this nondescript appearance, right?" "That's right." That living being was rather ashamed. Gui Shou thought for a while and said, "In that case, I'll ask first to see if I can teach you the template of the innate Tao constitution." As he spoke, without waiting for the living being to kneel and thank him, he closed his eyes. His mind slowly followed some kind of inexplicable connection and was transmitted to a country countless light years away. Through the mind of a powerful false saint, he transmitted his will over. In that instant, he felt his mind directly traverse an endless distance and arrive in a strange world. This was the mind of that false saint. What he was doing now was obviously using some kind of inseparable connection between himself and the living beings he had created that could transcend the barriers of time and space to allow his mind to traverse a distance that was difficult for him to traverse and return to the civilized country in the center. While the fake saint was cultivating, he suddenly felt a supreme figure appear in his heart. With a jolt of his heart, he instantly knew what was going on. He did not dare to delay and gathered his power into that figure, taking the opportunity to transfer that figure out of his heart. In an instant, Gui Shou's figure had already left his mind and appeared directly in front of the false saint. This method looked like he had directly sent a projection here, but in reality, the situation was completely different. It was not difficult for the current Gui Shou to create a projection. However, in this incomparably mysterious world, it was almost impossible for his projection to cross such a long distance to come here. At this moment, the figure was indeed Gui Shou, but it was just a fake body formed by the power of the false saint that he had entrusted his mind to. In other words, the foundation of this body was actually this false saint. As long as there was any problem with the false saint, regardless of whether the mind of this body was Gui Shou's mind or not, regardless of how much stronger Gui Shou's mind was compared to the false saint, it would definitely collapse and be destroyed. However, using such a transfer had already solved the problem that Gui Shou was too far away from this location, so he could not quickly come here to ask Luo Fan. The false saint directly bowed to Gui Shou. Gui Shou did not waste any time talking to him, and only said that he had come here for something. He told him that there was no need for him to be so polite, then turned around and stepped out of the cave abode. This cave abode was a small world. Under normal circumstances, even if other false saints came here, it would probably be difficult for them to break through easily and it would be impossible for them to come and go as they pleased. However, this was naturally not the case for Gui Shou. Not only did Gui Shou's identity prevent the false saint from restricting him from entering and leaving, but Gui Shou's own strength was also many times stronger than that of the false saint. Therefore, even if this cave abode was restricted by the false saint, it was just a matter of a thought for Gui Shou. After leaving this small world, Gui Shou directly controlled the fake body and came to the hall where Luo Fan was, directly stepping into the hall. At this moment, Luo Fan was still cultivating with his eyes closed. There was an inexplicable aura surrounding his body. It was a charm that no one could remember after seeing it. Gui Shou could not help but be shocked when he saw it. Gui Shou did not say anything. Luo Fan had already sensed his arrival. He slowly opened his eyes and looked at Gui Shou. In an instant, he had already seen through Gui Shou's current state and nodded slightly. It was quite ingenious to be able to think of such a method to send his mind back. The fact that he could think of this proved that Gui Shou had already made great progress in the use of his own abilities. "Greetings, Master." Gui Shou bowed first. Luo Fan faintly said that there was no need for formalities, then said, "You're not preaching everywhere, what are you doing here?" Gui Shou did not dare to delay and hurriedly told him everything about that living being. In the end, he even told him about his idea of teaching that living being the innate Tao aptitude template. After hearing this, Luo Fan pondered for a while before sighing and saying, "I didn't expect there to be such a living being. There are really many strange things in the world." With one look, Gui Shou knew that the living being probably had a great background. He could not help but ask, "May I ask, Master, what is the origin of that living being?" "It is the fate of the country," Luo Fan said with a smile. "The fate of the country?" Gui Shou was secretly shocked. Something like the fate of the country. He had never heard of it before, but this was the first time he had heard of it. From this name, he could already feel the lingering charm within it. That's right, it's not a natural creature of this world. It is a living being condensed from the fate of the countries where you preach. In essence, it is very different from the natural living beings in this world. As for the fate of the country, it is the fate of the country and the fate of all living beings. In essence, it is closely related to the whole country and all the living beings in the country, Luo Fan said with a smile. So it is like this. How can the fate of the country become a living being? Gui Shou was shocked. Come to think of it, you left the divine beast guarding the country to share the pressure of these countries, so that the fate of these countries became more and more intense. In the end, it broke through a certain limit and naturally gave birth to spiritual intelligence, turning into a living being, Luo Fan said with a smile. Gui Shou's expression changed when he heard this, and he said, Then, this living being is by my side now. If it leaves those countries, won't it affect them? Luo Fan shook his head and said, Of course not. It is a good thing that it is by your side, not a bad thing. Those countries are scattered. Even if you go to them and teach them the great Tao, they are independent of each other and can't be considered as a whole, let alone integrate their power. But now, with their kingdom fates by your side, they have fused into one. All of the kingdoms have naturally become one. They integrate with each other and complement each other. In the future, as long as one country is not destroyed, one or two countries will be destroyed, and they will have a chance to rise again because of the supplement from other countries. This, however, is an extremely good thing. Gui Shou heaved a sigh of relief. With Luo Fan's words, he was completely relieved. However, don't be careless. Since that living being is the manifestation of the fate of the country, its life and death are naturally connected to the fate of the country. If it grows, the fate of the country will naturally grow. But if it is killed one day, then the fate of those countries will instantly plummet, and it will be difficult to recover. You must remember this, Luo Fan warned. Gui Shou's expression became solemn, and he said, I will definitely remember this. Since you understand, then go. With your current realm, I think you already know what method you need to give it to cultivate and what method you need to use to nurture it. I won't say more, Luo Fan said lightly. Gui Shou didn't dare to delay any longer. He hurriedly bowed and said his goodbyes. Then, his mind directly separated from the fake body in front of Luo Fan, using that inexplicable connection. With the help of that inexplicable connection, he instantly returned to his original body that was billions of light years away. As his consciousness left the fake body, it instantly collapsed and directly turned into traces of invisible power, disappearing without a trace in the blink of an eye. After Gui Shou left, Luo Fan sighed, What are you two doing outside instead of working hard to cultivate? As soon as he finished speaking, at the entrance of the hall, Qing Yi and Yu Zhi's figures appeared. At this time, the two of them looked a little wronged. In the end, it was Yu Zhi who stepped forward. She bowed and said, Gui Shou has become so strong now, but the two of us are still making no progress. I hope that Master can point out a bright path for us. Qing Yi also bowed at the side. She didn't say anything, but just looked at Luo Fan with burning eyes. Usually, Yu Zhi was more fluent in making such requests. Compared to Yu Zhi, Qing Yi was more intelligent, so it was not easy for her to say such things. However, regardless of whether they said it or not, there was not much difference in their thoughts. Hearing this, Luo Fan sighed helplessly and said, What do you want? We also want to become as strong as Gui Shou, Yu Zhi said directly. Have the two of your worlds been reinforced? Yes. It had been fortified many years ago. Now that we are gone, these worlds can safely exist. But that's not right. But this seems to be meaningless, Yu Zhi said. Luo Fan shook his head and said, How is it meaningless? Don't think that these worlds are safe just because they are in the center of the country. It is more dangerous here than in other places. Without your reinforcement, if you leave this place, they might be crushed by the power of the country in a few days. Qing Yi and Yu Zhi responded with an "oh" at this time. They still looked at Luo Fan with their eyes. Luo Fan was helpless under their gaze and said, all right. Since you want to catch up to Gui Shou, I will point out a bright path for you. Thank you, master. Qing Yi and Yu Ji were overjoyed and hurriedly bowed to the ground. The joy that emanated from their bodies swept away their previous depression. In the blink of an eye, they looked like two completely different people compared to before. Luo Fan saw that they had already changed so much with just a sentence from him, and he had not come up with any solutions. He knew that this was a sign of their boundless trust in him, and he could not help but feel a little helpless. How could he casually answer them like this? He had no choice but to say, "Before this, the two of you were not born with intelligence, and the difference in nature had determined that you would never be able to catch up to Guizhou. But now, the world has changed, and your born Taoism aptitude has given you a chance to surpass the limits of your bodies, and catch up to Guizhou." Qing Yi and Yu Ji almost could not help but ask Luo Fan what they should do at this time. Fortunately, although they were anxious, they had not lost their rationality, and finally resisted this impulse. Luo Fan did not waste time and said directly, "The simplest way is to turn around and enter a civilized country, become an ordinary creature in this country, and obtain the identity of the protagonist of this world. Although the starting point will be countless times worse, because of this identity, you will definitely be able to improve after reincarnation without any obstacles. In the end, as long as you have enough time, you will naturally be able to break through the obstacles and reach Guizhou's current level." Hearing this, Qing Yi and Yu Ji looked anxious. They wanted Luo Fan to point out the way to catch up to Guizhou. If they turned around and entered a civilized country, wouldn't they become Guizhou's creation? How could they accept this? However, I think you will definitely not choose this method. Luo Fan did not wait for them to protest and continued. His words finally made Qing Yi and Yu Ji heave a sigh of relief. Apart from this simplest method, there is only one other way that can let you break the shackles of your bodies, and obtain the same achievements as those born with intelligence. At this point, Luo Fan paused and said, "This method is to pass the heavenly tribulation." "Pass the heavenly tribulation?" Qing Yi and Yu Ji exclaimed. Chapter 1600. Fawn color equals red, squinting eyes face B. That's right. Tribulations are tests from heaven and earth. Those who pass the tests will naturally be blessed by heaven and earth, and receive great benefit. It's only natural for them to surpass the limits of their own lives, Luo Fan said plainly. Qing Yi and Yu Ji could not help but tremble when they heard that. "Well, master, the tribulations from heaven and earth are so terrifying. I'm afraid we won't be able to withstand it." Qing Yi bit the bullet and said, "Since we're going to use the tribulations from heaven and earth to temper ourselves, we naturally can't let the tribulations come without any restrictions like when we're unprepared. We naturally need to use some methods to limit the power of the tribulations." Luo Fan smiled. After saying that, he looked at Qing Yi and Yu Ji quietly and waited for their decision. In fact, apart from reincarnation, going through the tribulations was indeed the only way for them to surpass the limits of their bodies and finally catch up to Guizhou. The reason was simple. If they wanted to catch up to Guizhou and break through the natural shackles that heaven and earth placed on them, they would be challenging the rules of heaven and earth itself. That would obviously trigger a reaction from heaven and earth, and thus cause the tribulations to come. This was similar to the transformation tribulation that Guizhou triggered when he transformed into a born Taoism aptitude. Under such circumstances, the tribulations that came because of breaking through the limits naturally contained the mystery of allowing living beings to break through their limits. Therefore, if the tribulations could be used to summon the tribulations first, by using the tribulations to temper one's body, one would naturally be able to retain the mystery within and allow one to break through their limits. This was the fundamental principle behind Luo Fan's plan. This principle made the entire process seem simple and clear, but the most difficult part was how to summon the tribulation, as well as how to limit the power of the tribulation. This was to prevent the tribulation from not being able to refine the body, and instead destroying the summoner, Qing Yi and Yu Ji thought for a long time. Finally, they looked at each other, gritted their teeth, and kowtowed to Luo Fan. They said, "Master, please teach us how to summon the tribulations to temper ourselves." For them to say this, Luo Fan was not surprised at all. After all, the two of them could no longer return to their previous muddle-headed state after their intelligence had increased. Especially, after witnessing the terrifying creatures that could destroy them with a single thought, it was even more impossible for them to remain content with the status quo. Under such circumstances, they had encountered the method of advancement that Luo Fan had given them. Even if this method was extremely dangerous, they could not give it up, even if it was for that 1 in a million chance. Therefore, as they spoke, he raised his finger and transmitted the technique he had created based on the principles of summoning tribulations into their minds with the help of his finger. At this moment, their eyes flashed with countless runes, as well as the deepest shock. The technique created by Luo Fan was so complicated and mysterious. Even though the two of them already knew the principles behind it, they were still extremely shocked by the level of thinking that Luo Fan revealed. Amidst the shock, Qing Yi and Yu Ji kowtowed to Luo Fan and kept thanking Luo Fan for teaching them the technique. "There's no need to be so polite. The faster you cultivate this technique, the better. Don't delay it," Luo Fan said faintly. Hearing this, Qing Yi and Yu Ji were even more grateful. They bowed to Luo Fan again. Then, the two of them left the hall that Luo Fan was in. After they left the hall, the two of them directly found a world and entered it. Then, they began to carefully comprehend the mysterious method that Luo Fan had taught them. Both of them had extraordinary wisdom, and the technique that Luo Fan taught them was created according to their situation. Therefore, the two of them comprehended the technique very smoothly. In just a few short days, they had already clearly comprehended all the profundities of this technique. In a daze, they even had an indescribable feeling in their hearts, as if there was a supreme existence somewhere in the world. Moreover, it was constantly brewing some kind of unimaginable destruction, and it was about to gush out an inconceivable power to destroy everything. Before this, not only could the two of them not sense its existence, but they also did not know what it was used for. However, after comprehending the technique that Luo Fan taught them, they knew that it was actually the source of all tribulations in the world. In other words, it was the beginning of all tribulations in the world, the source of all tribulations. Of course, they were actually quite clear in their hearts that the origin of tribulations itself might not exist, and what they sensed now was merely a product that was materialized from some abstract existence described in the technique. After clearly sensing the source of tribulations, Qing Yi and Yu Ji knew that they had reached the point where they could use the technique. When they thought about how Guei Shou had already left them far behind, an indescribable fighting spirit surged in their hearts. After discovering that they could already use the technique, how could they still hesitate? Immediately, the two of them stepped out of the world that they were in and appeared outside the world. They appeared above the mountain peak in the center of the civilized country. Then, they looked at each other and saw the indescribable determination in each other's eyes. After that, they did not hesitate. They slowly closed their eyes and slowly activated the technique that Luo Fan taught them. As the technique was being used, an indescribable charm was naturally emitted from the two of them. It was as if they were breaking through their own limits and surpassing the natural shackles of their bodies. Under this charm, the aura from their bodies began to slowly seep out. It began to surge in all directions and gradually formed an indescribable impact on the surrounding void. Under this change, the void above their heads gradually began to change. A cluster of increasingly dense and obvious dark clouds began to rapidly condense. Moreover, within the dark clouds, one could feel the sound of lightning flashing, as if some kind of incomparably terrifying power was brewing within and could strike down at any time. At this moment, Luo Fan, who was in the palace, seemed to have sensed something. He opened his eyes and his gaze penetrated through the layers of barriers. He directly saw the changes happening to Qing Yi and Yu Ji's bodies. Will they be able to break through? At this moment, such a thought directly appeared in his mind. Although he was confident that there wouldn't be any problems with the technique he created, he had never tested it before. Therefore, he didn't know how to use it. Compared to the other techniques he had created, he was the least confident that this technique could succeed. This lack of confidence was only relative to the other techniques he had created. In fact, on an absolute level, he was still quite confident that this technique could succeed. At this moment, there was already a change on Qing Yi and Yu Ji's side. In the void above, within the cluster of clouds, suddenly 2 bolts of lightning fiercely struck down from the cluster of clouds, directly bombarding the 2 of them. The nature of this lightning was so mysterious and incredible. Even though the 2 of them instinctively gathered their strength to resist, in the end, the lightning still completely ignored their defenses and directly bombarded their heads. Then, it directly flowed around their bodies and attacked them, finally making them feel everything about themselves. Even the source of their lives suffered an indescribable impact, causing unimaginable pain. At this moment, both Qing Yi and Yu Ji felt as if their entire bodies were about to collapse and be destroyed. What a powerful tribulation! This thought appeared in their minds almost at the same time. It should be known that the tribulation they had guided was only the most basic and weakest of tribulations. However, this kind of tribulation already made them feel as if they could not bear it. One could imagine how terrifying this tribulation was. However, now that things had already begun, they could no longer afford to regret it. No matter how painful and dangerous it was, they could only forcefully endure it. At this moment, the 2 of them had completely dispelled all distracting thoughts. They only focused on circulating the technique, trying their best to borrow the power of the technique to guide the power of the tribulations to attack the invisible shackles that existed on their bodies. Just the slightest trace of the tribulation's power was clearly not enough to break through the shackles. Therefore, at this moment, although the shackles were slightly loosened under the impact, they were still there when the power of the lightning was completely exhausted. They were still restraining and shackling them, preventing them from truly transcending and narrowing the gap between them and the Gui Shou in terms of intrinsic quality. However, they had already attacked the shackles after all. At this moment, an indescribable hope surged in their hearts. After the lightning's power was exhausted, the 2 of them didn't even have the time to look at each other before they circulated the technique again to summon the tribulation's power above the clouds above them. In an instant, another 2 lightning bolts blasted down from the clouds and struck their bodies in the blink of an eye. They continued to wreak havoc in their bodies, constantly tempering everything in them, including their life origin. Due to their previous experience, the lightning they guided this time was around twice as large as the first lightning bolt, and the pain they felt was even more intense than before. This kind of pain caused the 2 of them to once again feel fear and regret. However, the impact of the lightning bolt on the invisible shackles allowed them to see hope again. It allowed them to toss their regret and fear aside. Similarly, the second lightning bolt did not break through the invisible shackles. However, it was still the tribulation's power. Even if it did not pose a threat to the shackles, it still brought them a lot of benefits after passing through it. It allowed their bodies to endure an indescribable tempering. Yes, compared to before, their bodies had improved a little. Their ability to endure the lightning bolts had also increased. And this was obviously great news for the 2 of them. After they sensed that the lightning still couldn't break through the shackles, they guided even stronger lightning bolts to descend. They continued to refine their bodies, and continued to attack the invisible shackles. This process continued and continued. In the blink of an eye, several years had passed. Over the past few years, Qing Yi and Yu Ji had been summoning the lightning to descend at all times, continuously refining their bodies and attacking the invisible shackles. From the beginning until now, the lightning bolts had already reached several 100,000. The number of lightning bolts that the two of them had endured had already reached hundreds of thousands. The power of the lightning bolts was extremely weak in the beginning. It had grown to the point where it could completely destroy them in an instant. However, even though it had increased to this point, it could only shake the invisible shackles. At most, it could only greatly loosen the invisible shackles. However, it could not break through the invisible shackles at all. To Qing Yi and Yu Ji, this brought them great pain. It was not just the endless pain that the lightning bolts brought to their bodies. More importantly, the power of the lightning bolts would shake the invisible shackles every time. But in the end, the invisible shackles would return to normal after the power of the lightning bolts was completely exhausted. This brought them even more pain. This feeling was like that of an ordinary person. Clearly, as long as they grabbed this small card, they would be able to win a grand prize of several 100 million yuan. However, someone had placed this card in a place where they could touch it but could not grab it no matter what they did. It was self-evident how much pain it brought to their hearts. Qing Yi and Yu Ji, who were in the tribulation, did not have a single piece of good flesh on their bodies. The two of them hovered in the void like two charred corpses. At this moment, where was their usual beauty and cuteness? Where was their calmness and calmness? The reason for this was very simple. The increase in the power of the tribulation had gradually broken through their bodies' defenses. It was already gradually harming their bodies. In other words, their bodies. They could no longer bear the burden. This only represented one fact, and that was that they had reached their temporary cultivation limit. Their cultivation that had lasted for several years was about to come to an end. At that moment, Qing Yi and Yu Ji both roared out in unwillingness. They summoned a bolt of lightning that was more powerful than any they had seen before from the clouds. The two bolts of lightning were like two sharp swords that descended from the sky and stabbed at the two of them. With a soft swoosh, the two bolts of lightning poured into their heads out of thin air. With a loud bang, their bodies suddenly collapsed and turned into countless tiny fragments that flew in all directions. The two of them suddenly let out shrill screams. Following the change, the indescribable charm and the inconceivable aura that they had exuded had completely disappeared. With the disappearance of the charm and aura, the clouds that existed in the void naturally disappeared as well. The entire sky that had been dark for several years had thus regained its clarity. After the sky regained its clarity for a while, countless tiny fragments quickly gathered in the void. In the blink of an eye, Qing Yi and Yu Ji had condensed in their original positions. The two of them who had condensed looked completely normal. However, they were no longer the charred corpses from before. Instead, they had returned to their original state where they had not been injured at all. They were still as beautiful and cute as before. In the end, we're still not strong enough. Qing Yi sighed. That's right. If our bodies were a little stronger, we might have succeeded this time. Yu Ji also said rather discontentedly. At this moment, Luo Fan's voice suddenly rang in their ears. Why are you so discontented? Do you think that the technique I've created is so crude? Are you thinking that you can master it on your first try? The voice shocked Qing Yi and Yu Ji. The discontentment on their faces suddenly disappeared completely. What replaced it was a kind of awakening from a dream, a kind of sudden realization. That's right. This is only our first time cultivating this technique. Saying that we've just learned it is already an exaggeration. How would we dare to plan on mastering it on our first try? Such thoughts flashed through their minds. After that thought, the two of them could not help but reveal indescribable shame. Qing Yi and Yu Ji hurriedly bowed towards the hall that Luo Fan was in and said, "Thank you for your advice, master. If not for you, we would have made the mistake of being too impatient. Cultivate well. As long as you persevere, this technique will definitely allow you to break through your shackles and surpass your limits," Luo Fan said plainly. It was due to the various changes that had happened during Qing Yi and Yu Ji's heavenly tribulations. He was completely sure that the method he had created to allow living beings to break through their limits was an absolutely effective method. Yes. Regarding Luo Fan's order, Luo Fan nodded. Qing Yi and Yu Ji naturally agreed without hesitation. After they agreed, Luo Fan naturally shut his mouth and stopped paying attention to them. Instead, he slowly closed his eyes again. He began to continue his cultivation. After Luo Fan's voice disappeared, Qing Yi and Yu Ji did not stay at the place where the heavenly tribulation was held. There was nothing here. It was empty and spacious. Naturally, it was only suitable for the heavenly tribulation, not suitable for them to cultivate here. Each of them turned around and stepped into one of the 30 million worlds they had opened up. When they returned to that world and felt the wonderful and relaxed feeling, the two of them suddenly rejoiced that they had opened up so many worlds. In fact, when I really remember, although the presence of so many worlds was quite a burden for the two of them, they had to first resolve the existence of those worlds before leaving this place. However, it was precisely because of these worlds that they had been able to improve so quickly. It was also because of these worlds that they were able to grow to this level in the end. Without the oppression of these worlds, they might still be at the stage where they were at the very beginning. Although they had intelligence, they had no understanding of the various states of the mortal world. Their use of intelligence would also be at an extremely inferior level. How could they have achieved what they did now? Perhaps, back then, Master placed the fate of these worlds behind us because of this. For a moment, such a thought flashed across their minds. However, if Luo Fan knew about this, he would definitely say that they were thinking too much. It was normal for Qing Yi and Yu Ji to have such a mentality. Most people would think well of someone they respected. Even if it was a seemingly meaningless arrangement or action, they would naturally attach special meaning to it. In particular, when they unconsciously benefited from such an arrangement, they would naturally attribute the credit to the person they respected. Although Qing Yi and Yu Ji were not ordinary mortals, they were also living beings with complete intelligence. Of course, they could not avoid such a mentality. After expressing their admiration for Luo Fan in their hearts in this world, they began to find a place to cultivate. In the past few years, they had cultivated the technique that Luo Fan had taught them. Although they had not broken through their most important goal, which was to break the invisible shackles that had restricted them, they had already obtained boundless benefits from the tribulation. Putting everything else aside, at this moment, their sense of that inexplicable place was already more than 10 times clearer than before. That was because this feeling brought about all sorts of inexplicable divine abilities and inexplicable methods, but because of this, they were also greatly enhanced. Just this alone had already made the two of them several dozen times stronger than before. Not to mention that their bodies and even their life essence had become thousands of times stronger than before after being refined time and time again. The effect of this increase in strength was already quite considerable. When the two of them truly sorted out their gains, their admiration for Luo Fan was even more uncontrollable. Chapter 1601. Just as Qing Yi and Yu Ji were working hard to use the power of the tribulations to refine themselves and improve themselves, in another civilization that was billions of light-years away from this civilization, Gui Shou was giving pointers to the creature formed by that civilization's national providence. After receiving Luo Fan's pointers and learning about this creature's true essence, he felt that this creature was completely different from before. Originally, the creature he saw in his eyes was clearly a bit strange, its essence blurry, difficult to see through. But now, the situation was completely different. Now that he looked at this creature again, he could tell at a glance that there was a strange existence that was closely related to any of the civilizations that he had passed through in the past. Seeing this clearly, Gui Shou no longer had any doubts about what Luo Fan said about this creature being formed by the national providence of those civilizations. At this moment, the creature was still sitting below Gui Shou, looking at him with an anxious and expectant gaze. Around him, The other living beings that had been enlightened by the turtle lifespan were also looking at him with expressions similar to those of other living beings. When Guai Shou slowly opened his eyes, there seemed to be a strange light shining in all of the creature's eyes. Guai Shou was not surprised by this at all. He just said to the creature formed by the national providence, "I already understand your essence. Next, you will cultivate according to this method. If you succeed in your cultivation, you will definitely obtain great benefit." With that, he pointed. He casually pointed with his finger, and in an instant, boundless information gathered into a ray of spiritual light that directly rushed into the creature's mind, completely fusing with its memories. At this moment, the creature's body trembled, and there seemed to be endless characters and runes flashing in its eyes. Not long after, a look of shock and joy appeared on its face. It directly bowed to Guai Shou and said, "Thank you, Creator, for your help." Guai Shou sighed, raised his hand, and made a gesture. Then, a vast power was generated naturally. He slowly lifted it up. Afterward, Guai Shou said, "No need to be so polite. Cultivate well." The creature naturally could not help but nod. After doing all this, Guai Shou did not stay here any longer. He led the many living beings toward another kingdom that they had yet to visit. The moment they left the country, Guai Shou saw the nation's fate fuse with the creature in an unbelievable way. They saw. In that split second, all living beings within the kingdom naturally produced wisps of extremely illusionary presences that even Guai Shou could only faintly sense, but could not touch or change. These strands of strange existences were like rivers flowing into the sea, flowing into the being formed by the destiny of the nation from far away. They converged inside its body, and became a strange existence that was on par with the countless other existences. After that instant, Guai Shou sensed that the relationship between the creature in front of him and the civilized country they had just left had once again become shockingly close. It was as if all changes would affect that civilized country. So that's how it gathers the destiny of the nation, Guai Shou thought to himself. At that moment, the status of the being formed by the destiny of the nation in his heart suddenly began to rise by several levels. It had even surpassed the status of any civilized country. When they arrived at the next civilized country, Guai Shou did not immediately go to the country to eliminate the possible hidden dangers around it, nor did he immediately open up an island to preach. Instead, he directly began to create a world suitable for the cultivation of the being formed by the destiny of the nation. He directly threw the being into it, allowing the destiny of the nation, which had already comprehended the method he had passed on, to enter the world, allowing it to begin the most important cultivation in its life. The being formed by the destiny of the nation had a strong sense of admiration for Guai Shou. It accepted all of Guai Shou's arrangements from the bottom of its heart. After being thrown into this world, it did not show any strange behavior. Instead, it directly began to cultivate according to Guai Shou's plan. For the destiny of the nation, the most important cultivation was to obtain a born Taoism aptitude. As a being formed by the destiny of the nation that was formed by beings with born Taoism aptitude, if it did not have a born Taoism aptitude, how could it be completely compatible with that country? In this world, it slowly circulated its power and began to reconstruct its body from the inside out. It worked hard to change its body from a rough human form to a real born Taoism aptitude. If such a process was done by any other ordinary being in this world, it would definitely cause a reaction from the world. Even if it did not trigger a transformation tribulation, many other strange phenomena would definitely appear. However, the being in front of it was different. The process of its body transforming into a born Taoism aptitude was a natural process. It did not cause any abnormal behavior at all. It was already over. It felt as if the world had been waiting for it to transform into a born Taoism aptitude for a long time. In the end, when it truly transformed into a born Taoism aptitude, it suddenly felt an indescribable feeling. In a trance, it had already understood where its essence was. It knew that it was the destiny of many nations. For a moment, its entire body shone brightly. It did not wait to leave this civilized nation before it absorbed the nation's destiny into its body. It completely integrated with its own life essence. At this moment, the entire civilized nation trembled slightly. Vaguely, it seemed to have become much heavier, as if there was an incomparably stable support beneath the country. This change was directly reflected in the hearts of all the beings in the entire civilized nation. It suddenly gave them an indescribable confidence. This confidence that came out of nowhere changed their every move. Some cultivators even directly obtained tangible benefits because of this change in mentality. They directly broke through the limits of their cultivation realm and stepped into a whole new realm. As for all these changes, Gui Shou naturally felt it in his heart. For a moment, he felt extremely fortunate that he had brought along the living beings formed by the nation's destiny. Putting everything else aside, just the fact that it could fuse the nation fate of all the civilized countries together, allowing all the countries to become one, supporting and relying on each other, was already a great benefit. It was of great significance to the new main character of this world. Transforming into a born Taoism aptitude was only the first step in the cultivation of the nation's destiny. Next, using the born Taoism aptitude as the foundation to cultivate was the true main body of cultivation. However, this was already a normal cultivation process. It would be fine as long as it followed the prescribed order. Naturally, there was no need for Gui Shou to pay attention to it anymore. Immediately, he began to carry out the procedures that had to be carried out every time he entered a new civilized nation. He sent out many living beings to eliminate the hidden dangers around the nation. At the same time, he began to build islands. He announced the sermon. This was a process that had happened countless times, so there was no need to say anything more. Just like that, another 30,000 years passed. During those 30,000 years, Gui Shou was still the same as before, constantly searching the world. He visited the civilized countries that were born in the world and established by the living beings with born Taoism aptitude, passing on the complete and mature way of cultivation. He guided all the cultivators in the civilized nations so that they could understand cultivation and understand the direction to move forward. And now, even though such a long time had passed, he still only walked through a very small part of the world. In terms of the number of nations that he had walked through, there were already hundreds of thousands of them. However, in his senses, he could feel that outside of the range he had walked through, there were still many more civilized nations than the ones he had walked through waiting for him. After such a long time, although there were still thousands of intelligent living beings around him, among these living beings, there was only one that was the same as 30,000 years ago, and that was the nation's destiny. As for the rest of the living beings, they were all living beings that he had recently enlightened. According to Master, it's not the territory of the big organization ahead. On this day, Gui Shou stopped at a certain place with the thousands of creatures and thought to himself. This place was a river. This river could even be called an ocean. What flowed in this river was not any kind of liquid that he had seen before. Instead, it seemed to be an extremely chaotic existence that was similar to a state of chaos. The existence of this vehicle was indescribably violent. It was impossible for any living beings to exist in it. Even Gui Shou had to summon the concept of nothingness to protect himself if he wanted to step into it. Only then could he remain unharmed, let alone other living beings. Even if living beings with innate intelligence used the power that was summoned to protect themselves, they would probably be torn apart and devoured by the violent existence flowing in the river. As for why Gui Shou knew that there was another region ahead, the reason was even simpler. Over the years, Gui Shou had used the same method to send his consciousness back to the central civilized country to ask Luo Fan for guidance, and he had been guided by Luo Fan. At this moment, Guiyun, who was standing next to Gui Shou, asked curiously, "Creator, why aren't we advancing? Is there any danger ahead?" After spending 30,000 years together day and night, the living beings formed by the nation's destiny had already become extremely close to Gui Shou, and the sense of admiration between them was several times deeper than before. It was because of this that he dared to say such curious words at this time. "It's not dangerous, but it's different ahead from here. I wonder if there will be any changes in the environment." Gui Shou smiled. At this moment, he had already adjusted his mood, and with a thought, he summoned the concept of nothingness and instantly enveloped all the living beings present. Immediately afterward, he led them forward without hesitation. Although he did not plunge into the river and directly endure the violent and chaotic impact of the river. Originally, there should have been no problem without this concept of nothingness to protect them. However, this river was simply too chaotic and violent. The river's top, bottom, left, right, front, back, and forth could change at any time. In other words, even if they crossed the river's surface, before they finally crossed the river's surface could change at any time, changing from above to below at any time. In fact, during the short period of time that Gui Shou had stayed here, the river had already changed several times. Under such circumstances, without the concept of nothingness to protect them, crossing this river with so many living beings, that was simply courting death. Because of this, Gui Shou made such a move at this time. This river was extremely wide, and the moment they walked to the center of the river, loud splashing sounds suddenly came from below. Amidst the loud sounds, the river suddenly moved up and down, and the area that was originally above and outside the river suddenly became inside the river. On the contrary, the area below, which was originally chaotic and violent impact, became the area above the river's surface. The violent river water constantly crashed into everything around it, destroying anything that did not belong to the river water. It directly rushed towards Gui Shou and the others. In the blink of an eye, the concept of nothingness that had appeared around Gui Shou and the others produced countless ripples and fluctuations. But these ripples, these fluctuations, none of them truly broke through the cage of the concept of nothingness. None of them truly harmed Gui Shou. Moreover, they did not harm the thousands of other living beings protected by Gui Shou. This change caused many living beings below the turtle lifespan to reveal expressions of panic. Although these living beings were all transformed by Gui Shou, and the things they had seen were all brought to them by Gui Shou. However, this did not mean that they did not know the danger, nor did it mean that their survival instincts had disappeared. The river in front of them was so strange and violent. How could they not feel the danger contained in it? How could they not know what would happen if they threw themselves into it without concealment? Under such circumstances, seeing these terrifying impacts directly colliding with a place not far from them, seeing that they were about to touch their bodies and be sucked into the river, how could they not feel horrified? With the concept of nothingness as the protection, it was naturally a simple matter to break through this river. Gui Shou controlled this concept of nothingness, disregarding all the changes around him. He just brutally and forcefully attacked. In a short while, he had crossed the incomparably wide river and directly rushed out, arriving at the territory that did not belong to the big organization. At first glance, this place seemed to be no different from the territory of that big organization from before. However, if one were to carefully sense it, one would be able to discover that this world was filled with a faintly discernible, indistinct, and seemingly illusory will. The essence of this kind of will was so advanced that the moment Gui Shou sensed this will, he suddenly had a feeling that he had suddenly returned to the central civilized country and saw Luo Fan with his own eyes. So powerful! Such a thought instantly appeared in Gui Shou's mind. After this thought, he could not help but feel a little uneasy. One had to know that under such a powerful, boundless, and unbelievable willpower, Everything he did seemed to be done right under the other party's nose. If he was not careful, he might violate some taboo and anger the other party. At that time, he would not even know how he died. While feeling uneasy, Gui Shou naturally stopped moving forward. He floated above the void and began to carefully sense and experience in his heart. He wanted to sense and understand the likes and dislikes of that will, and he wanted to understand where the bottom line of this terrifying will was. Unfortunately, this will was simply like heaven's will. It was so illusory. Even though Gui Shou was now so powerful and incredible compared to this will, he was still so weak. At this time, no matter how he tried to sense it, he could not sense anything. This included the likes and dislikes of this will's opinion of him, and this will's bottom line. When he carefully sensed it, what he had before was still the same. What he knew before was still unknown now. What he did not know before was still unknown now. With a slight sigh, Gui Shou finally knew how ridiculous it was to try to guess the plan of that will. He sighed helplessly. In the end, he decided to follow his original plan and began to move toward the location of the civilized country that he had sensed. Since he could not find the likes and dislikes of the other party, there was naturally no need to talk about avoiding or changing. Of course, he would go according to his original style and plan. Regarding Gui Shou's behavior, the creatures that were enlightened by Gui Shou naturally saw the fate of the country and were puzzled. However, their realm was still quite far from the realm where they could sense that incredible will. Even if that will was overwhelming and covered everything in this world, they still could not sense it. Under such circumstances, it was naturally impossible for them to know what Gui Shou was doing. In the nearest civilized country, it was dozens of light years away. Gui Shou led the group of living beings, and it only took them a few dozen breaths to arrive at this place. The moment he arrived, Gui Shou could not help but widen his eyes. He was inexplicably amazed by the scene in this civilized country. In the past, the countries that he had been to were in a weak position, no matter what. Some were besieged by the surrounding creatures, and were about to fall and be destroyed. Some were threatened by the surrounding creatures, and were worshipped almost like slaves in exchange for safety. Even if they were not threatened, those who were not attacked were also living carefully. They had all kinds of means to avoid, and their defenses were set up tightly. They did not dare to be careless. However, the civilized country in front of them was completely different from the civilized countries in the past. In this civilized country, the creatures with natural Taoism aptitude were enslaving countless creatures in this world. For example, now, not far in front of Gui Shou and the others, there was a creature that looked like a wild bull. It carried all kinds of tools on its body, and no one knew how many things it was carrying. It was walking at a moderate pace. On the back of that creature stood a creature with natural Taoism aptitude, and it was waving a long whip to command that creature in high spirits. Apart from this, all kinds of creatures in other places were being commanded by the creatures with natural Taoism aptitude in various ways, and they were doing all kinds of work. All of this made it seem as if the living beings in this civilized country were keeping the numerous natural living beings in captivity. How could this be? Even Gui Shou, who was knowledgeable, could not help but feel puzzled at this time. If it was said that the living beings in this country were indescribably powerful and could even subdue the natural beings in this world, and even the weakest living beings were equivalent to false saints, then he could understand why such a scene would appear. Even if he was extremely curious about how the strength of the living beings in this country had risen to such a level, however, the situation in front of him was clearly not like that. The creatures in this civilized country were similar to the creatures in any of the countries that he had passed by in the past. At most, only the most powerful ones had broken through the limit and entered the false saint level. There was still a long way to go before they could reach the level of being able to enslave all kinds of powerful creatures in this world at will. Therefore, it was obvious that the reason for all of this was definitely not because of their strength. At this moment, the creature formed by the nation's destiny beside Guai Shou came forward to report, "Creator, the nation's destiny here seems a little strange. It seems to be mixed with something. Right now, the living being that was formed from the nation's destiny had already become many times stronger than before. Its strength had already reached the false saint level, and it was similar to the kind of living being that was born in this world, a false saint that could easily guide power from an unknown place to descend. After increasing to this level, his perception of any nation's destiny had also reached a level that could not be compared to at the beginning. Presently, he only needed a single command in his heart to naturally gather the karmic luck of a kingdom into his body, no matter which kingdom he went to. Not only did it strengthen his own essence, it was even able to allow the karmic luck that was connected to him to fuse and complement each other to form an inseparable whole. Chapter 1602. Fawn B. What's mixed in? Guai Shou frowned. This civilized country was so different from the civilized countries he had seen in the past. If one were to say that there were no changes, he would not believe it at all. However, he did not expect such a change to appear in the country's fate. I don't know. I only feel that the country's fate seems to be rejecting me. It's more difficult for me to control it than any other country. Moreover, it's more difficult than all of them combined, Guiyun said. Let's take a look first, Guai Shou said faintly. As he spoke, he landed in the country. It was not like before, where he directly built the island in the void and summoned all living beings to listen to his teachings. At the same time, he put the living beings that he enlightened and the country's fate into a small world that he had opened up. This country was so strange that it was not strange for anything to appear in it. It was naturally inappropriate for other living beings to appear here. Therefore, Guai Shou was the only one who appeared in this nation at this moment. The entire territory of this country was tens of billions of miles wide. There were trillions of living beings with born Taoism aptitudes in this country. The structure of such a huge country was naturally extremely complicated. The place where Guai Shou landed was in an extremely ordinary city. As a country that existed in this powerful world, the cities in this world could not be compared to ordinary cities. One should know that the ordinary living beings in this world were at least equivalent to the false saint level. Even the living beings created by Guai Shou were countless times weaker than the natural living beings in this world. However, they were not comparable to ordinary living beings in this world. For example, the false saint level and sage-to-be living beings were at least experts in other worlds. They were strong enough to dominate the life and death of several worlds. However, such living beings in this civilized country, they were only relatively strong residents. In fact, their status was just like the martial arts masters in ordinary world. How special was a city that could accommodate such living beings? One could imagine. In this entire city, 1/3 of it was in the sky, 1/3 was underground, and 1/3 was on the ground. However, it was only 1/3 of its original size. The entire city appeared to be completely different from a sci-fi city. Above the sky, above the ground, below the ground, there were the shadows of living beings everywhere. They flew in the sky and burrowed into the ground, living in an extremely three-dimensional way. In this city, there weren't any powerful creatures that were born into this world. It wasn't because the residents of the city didn't enslave those creatures. Instead, even though they were angry at these creatures, they did not allow them to enter the city. This was the proper meaning of the question. After all, these living beings were simply too powerful. Even if they were enslaved by them, just their existence alone was enough to bring great pressure to the city. If anything went wrong, that would be the destruction of the entire city. Under such circumstances, how could they allow those creatures to enter the city? Guai Shou stepped into a restaurant that was floating in midair. The restaurant had an antique feel to it, and melodious music could be heard coming from it. There weren't many customers inside. But it wasn't that cold. When Gui Shou stepped into the restaurant, a waiter, who was probably equivalent to a primordial pure yang expert, greeted him politely. "Sir, please come in. May I know if you're here to eat or stay?" Gui Shou had been to so many countries, so he was very clear about the state of the human world. Although the customs of this country were different from those of other countries, there was not much difference at all. Therefore, he naturally knew how to deal with it. At this time, he had already restrained all his aura, so that the creatures in this country, who should have inexplicably sensed him as soon as they saw him, could not sense anything special about him at all. He glanced at the waiter and said lightly, "Let's eat. What signature dishes do you have? Bring them over." "Okay." The waiter responded loudly, then led the Gui Shou to a table near the window. If Gui Shou's current level was in other worlds, he would have reached the level of despair. Even though he had scruples here because of the strange country and dared not to spread out his perception unscrupulously to sense the truth behind this country, it didn't mean that he needed to talk to people around to find out what was going on in this country like ordinary people. As he sat there, his heart moved slightly. The memories of everyone in this restaurant were like a book in his hand, allowing him to flip through them at will and understand them at will. When the waiter brought over a dozen specialty dishes, he already had a general understanding of this country and vaguely knew why this country was so special. Among all the creatures in this restaurant, the strongest was only at the quasi-life level. Even in this country, this kind of creature could only be regarded as the bottom. Naturally, they knew very little about the secrets behind this country. However, if they were to integrate what they knew, it would be enough for Gui Shou to have a considerable understanding of the various aspects of the country. When this country first appeared, it was similar to all the other countries that Gui Shou had encountered before. It was also struggling between the heavens and the earth, struggling to survive under the pressure of many powerful beings, and facing the danger of destruction at all times. However, this history changed at a certain moment. At the juncture of life and death for the entire kingdom, a creature of unknown origin suddenly descended upon this kingdom. This being claimed to have traveled through time and space from the future, and he also had the appearance of a born Taoism aptitude. His arrival, as a result, it brought a powerful vitality to the entire kingdom, turning the kingdom from being enslaved by all other living beings to enslaving all other living beings. The reason for this change was very simple. This creature, it brought with it a divine ability that was said to have been created after an immeasurable amount of time. After cultivating this divine ability, a living being could have a seed that could command and enslave all natural creatures in this world. Of course, not all creatures could cultivate this divine ability and condense this seed. In fact, only those who could truly condense this seed. Only unimaginable geniuses could do it. For example, there were currently trillions of people in the entire kingdom. However, there were less than 10 million people who could truly cultivate this divine ability. This was almost a 1 in 100,000 chance, which was enough to show how high the requirements for this divine ability were. 10 million people. Gui Shou was eating the restaurant's signature dish, and he suddenly became extremely curious about this divine ability. It was not uncommon for only 10 million people to cultivate a divine ability out of trillions of people. At the very least, Gui Shou could create some by himself at any time. However, he could not create a divine ability that could obtain that seed and grow to the point where it could easily enslave creatures that were tens of thousands of times more powerful than them. Even though he had heard about the existence of such a divine ability, he did not know the principle behind it, and why a mere seed could produce such an effect. As for the fact that the being who imparted this divine ability came from the future after an immeasurable amount of time, he did not believe it at all. There was no other reason other than this. This was simply too absurd. If it was an ordinary world, it was still possible to travel from the future to the past. For example, in the Earth's universe, Luo Fan traveled from the future to the present time after an immeasurable amount of time with the help of the passage created by a true saint. However, don't forget, this was not an ordinary world. This was a world where the structure of time, space, matter, and energy was extremely mysterious, and even completely different from the ordinary time and space. In such a world, the relationship between the past, the present, and the future was not linear, but entangled in a very mysterious way. Under such circumstances, if one wanted to break this law and travel from the future to the past, or travel from the present to the future, or travel from the present to the past, one must at least be able to completely break the fundamental rules of this world, and have the ability to completely change the space-time structure of this entire world. And this, at least, could only be achieved by a being at the true saint level. And obviously, how could a being at the true saint level care about anything that happened in such a small country? How could he send a living being from the future to the past? Therefore, although Gui Shou didn't have much of an idea about what kind of being the being that taught the divine sense was, he clearly knew that it couldn't be from the future as it claimed to be. That divine sense can be found in the center of any city. It seems that I have to go and have a look later. With this thought, Gui Shou pushed the table away, got up, and took a step forward. His figure had already disappeared from the restaurant. Dine and dash. At this moment, the waiter noticed that the table was suddenly empty, and he couldn't help but show a look of surprise and anger on his face. Eating and dashing was something that any restaurant had encountered before. Even in this extremely special city, it was the same. Therefore, this restaurant actually had countless defensive measures against being eaten and dashed. They were prepared for how to recover after the incident and how to reduce the loss. However, this didn't mean that they had a way to deal with Gui Shou. There was no other reason other than their strength. The waiter reported to the shopkeeper. At first, the shopkeeper didn't care. He calmly followed the restaurant's original plan and used all kinds of means to find Gui Shou and recover the cost of the food and drink. However, when he couldn't find Gui Shou after using all the means, the shopkeeper's expression immediately changed. Humph! Such an expert actually dared to dine and dash. He shouted with a face full of anger and bitterly stopped. Gui Shou naturally didn't know that he would be criticized by the shopkeeper when he left directly. At this moment, he was already standing in the center of the city, looking at the divine sense engraved on the stone tablet in front of him. This divine sense was extremely important to this civilized country. Therefore, ever since it appeared, it was announced to the entire country, in order to let as many living beings as possible learn this divine sense. From then on, the number of living beings that could condense seeds would reach the highest level, so that the civilized country could enslave as many living beings as possible. This method of announcement was to set up such stone tablets in tens of thousands of cities in the entire country, and the divine sense was directly engraved on them so that everyone could see and learn it. It was precisely because of this. That was why almost every city enslaved at least one powerful creature to protect the city, or to help the city. Gui Shou stood in front of this stone tablet, his brows slightly furrowed. This divine sense had millions of words, and this stone tablet was at least 300 meters high. However, each word of this divine sense seemed to be extremely difficult to be engraved on it with the size of a grain of rice. Fortunately, the living beings in this country were extremely powerful. Their eyesight was extremely amazing. Otherwise, it would be meaningless to use such dense and small words to record it, no matter what. Gui Shou was in existence at the level of desperation. It was a divine art with millions of words, but he had already memorized all of them with a single glance. However, although he had memorized it, the doubts in Gui Shou's heart were not resolved because of this. On the contrary, he fell into deeper doubts, because he couldn't understand this divine sense at all, although he could know how to cultivate this divine sense and how to improve it. But in the end, what was the principle behind this divine ability? What method was used to condense the seed? What method was used to enslave and control creatures that were tens of thousands of times more powerful than the one who had condensed the seed? He was completely bewildered by all of this and could not understand it at all. He couldn't understand it. There's actually such a divine sense, Gui Shou thought to himself. For him, there was only one way to understand the real principle of this divine sense. That was to cultivate this divine sense. However, it was obvious that no matter how courageous he was, it was impossible for him to cultivate such a strange divine ability without understanding anything. It seems that I have to trouble Master again, Gui Shou sighed. Thinking of this, he lifted his foot and took a light step. In the blink of an eye, his figure had disappeared without a trace. He directly entered the small world that he had casually opened up with the raw milk. After entering this small world, Gui Shou did not care about the other living beings and directly sat down in the air. Relying on some extremely mysterious connection, he directly connected with the mind of a certain false saint on the mountain peak where Luo Fan was, who knew how many billions of light years away. He instantly sent his mind into it. That false saint was already familiar with all of this. At this moment, he naturally gathered his power on that mind and then transferred it out of his mind and into the real world. Gui Shou did not stop there. He stopped the false saint who was about to kneel and took a light step forward, directly arriving at the hall where Luo Fan was. The moment he appeared, Luo Fan had already sensed something. He slowly opened his eyes and said indifferently, "What problem did you encounter this time?" This voice was very ordinary, but to Gui Shou, it sounded like rolling thunder and contained an indescribable heavenly might. It was even to the extent that the voice was mixed with traces of willpower, giving him the feeling that he had sensed when he stepped out of the territory of the big organization. It was a supreme, vast and boundless willpower that filled the world. As expected, Master is still so powerful. At this moment, such a thought appeared in Gui Shou's mind. However, of course, he did not dare to neglect Luo Fan's questions. He directly told him everything that had happened in that special country. After hearing all of this, Luo Fan also frowned. He was also a little confused about the various things that happened in that country. Not bad. You still know to come back and ask me, Luo Fan said indifferently. Let me take a look at that mystical ability. Gui Shou nodded and condensed the millions of words of the mystical ability into a spot of spiritual light, sending it to Luo Fan. Luo Fan received the spiritual light, and the millions of words of the divine ability were instantly grasped by him. With a thought, this divine ability spread out in his mind. What an amazing ability! Even though it's not a true sage ability, it's not a true sage ability. No wonder you can't understand the principles behind it, Luo Fan said with a faint smile. This sacred art was different from any other sacred art that Luo Fan had seen before. It did not have the characteristic of a true divine sacred art that could evolve endlessly. There was a limit to its power. However, it forcibly simulated all the changes of a true divine God power within a certain boundary in a way that was not a true divine God power. In other words, he had forcibly simplified a true divine theurgy into a non-true divine theurgy, and kept as much of its power as possible. Gui Shou, who had seen the divine sense of a true divine, could recognize such a Shun Tong at a glance. However, for Gui Shou, who had never seen the divine sense of a true divine sense, Shen Tong could not understand it at all. That would be forcing him to do something he couldn't do. Since he knew what the essence of this divine theurgy was, he wanted to restore the original appearance of this divine theurgy. Naturally, it was an easy thing to do. Luo Fan's heart moved slightly. The many words continued to be simplified and reorganized. Not long after, the divine theurgy of millions of words had been reduced to more than 100 words. It had been reduced by tens of thousands of times. In an instant, it had been restored to a real true divine theurgy. Although the words on this divine art were tens of thousands of times fewer than before, the complexity and profoundness of this divine art was countless times stronger than the previous one. However, even if it was more complicated and mysterious, it had after all returned to its original appearance. It had become a simple thing to understand what was going on with this divine theurgy. So that's the case. It seems that someone has taken a fancy to the luck of the protagonist of this world. After seeing this true divine theurgy clearly, Luo Fan could not help but sigh. He felt that it was extremely troublesome. This divine theurgy. It was a true divine theurgy, and it indeed had infinite power. It did develop an extremely powerful seed that could enslave living beings. However, its most basic function was not that. It was seizing luck, or rather, seizing the halo living beings. There was the luck of living beings. There was the luck of a race. That was obvious. When a race became the protagonist of this world, it had actually obtained a protagonist halo. As this protagonist halo was targeted at an entire race, it was not a complete individual. Instead, it was spread across all living beings in the entire race in an extremely mysterious way. In other words, the luck world of all living beings in this race had a small portion of the main character's halo of the race. And only by combining a part of the protagonist halo above the luck of all living beings in the world, would the effect of the real protagonist halo be produced. No matter what kind of misfortune this race encountered, it would eventually turn misfortune into fortune and run in the direction of incomparably bright. Normally, such a halo would definitely not be able to be seized. Even Luo Fan, who had meticulously studied the protagonist halo, would definitely not be able to seize such a halo. However, it was obvious that a powerful existence had developed a method to seize such a halo. And that was this true divine theurgy. As long as a living being cultivated this theurgy, the halos in his world of luck would naturally be collected and transmitted to a certain direction. It would be very difficult for it to be condensed in a certain world of luck. In other words, even if this protagonist halo was scattered into countless parts, as long as there were enough living beings cultivating this theurgy, the person who transmitted this theurgy would be able to condense it easily and finally form a relatively complete protagonist halo, of course, unless all living beings were able to cultivate this divine ability, the main character's halo would be broken and incomplete. This was something that couldn't be changed. Moreover, if one really wanted to seize the protagonist halo completely, the most perfect method would be to directly cultivate this true divine theurgy, instead of cultivating the simplified and simulated theurgy of the true divine theurgy. However, it was obvious that such a thing would not happen. Although the true divine theurgy was unbelievably powerful, those who wanted to cultivate the true divine theurgy had to at least be at the false sage level. Currently, among the countless civilized countries in the entire world, there were only a few dozen people who had such strength. What was the use of that? In contrast, it would be different if this true divine theurgy was simplified and simulated. As it was no longer a true divine theurgy, there was no requirement for the cultivation realm of the person who cultivated it. As long as one had good aptitude and was suitable for this theurgy, it was possible to cultivate it. Chapter 1603. Luo Fan sighed and said to Gui Shou, "This god power is a god power that seizes luck. Now, a large portion of the kingdom's luck has already been taken away." Gui Shou couldn't help but be shocked. "What should we do?" "I can teach you another god power. If you teach this god power, you can reduce the tendency of this god power being seized." Luo Fan said faintly. "Only reduce the tendency?" Gui Shou frowned. Luo Fan said faintly, "That's right. The person who set up this method is not weaker than me. He has already taken action since the beginning of that kingdom, but we only took action now. Of course, it's not so easy to solve everything perfectly." Hearing this, although Gui Shou was still a little unwilling, he understood. Seeing that he understood, Luo Fan didn't say much. At this moment, countless true divine mysteries kept combining in his mind. Not long after, they formed a true divine God power that was opposite to the God power that he had organized before. It was a true divine God power that completely targeted all the effects of the true divine God power. The words used by the true divine theurgy were also only slightly more than 100 words. It was not much different from the true divine theurgy that he had sorted out previously. After Luo Fan created this God power, his heart moved again. In an instant, the God power with more than 100 words began to be born rapidly. In the blink of an eye, it had already grown from 100 words to millions of words. But, similarly, because this mystical power was too profound, in order to allow those who were not false saints to cultivate it, he degraded it. Using imitating and approaching methods, the requirements for cultivating this God power weren't so high. After evolving this God power, Luo Fan pointed with his finger. All the words condensed into a spiritual light and directly rushed towards Guei Shou. In the blink of an eye, it arrived in front of Guei Shou. Guei Shou took this spiritual light. In an instant, the God power with millions of words had already been imprinted into his memory. Compared to the God power that Guei Shou had given to Luo Fan before, the God power that Luo Fan had given him this time didn't just include the evolved imitation God power. Moreover, it directly included the origin of the God power. In other words, the true divine God power that had evolved millions of words was also given to him. At first, Guei Shou only had a vague understanding of these few million characters. He had no idea what this divine ability was talking about, nor did he know the principles behind this divine ability. However, when he finally saw the true divine God power formed by more than 100 words, he suddenly understood. In an instant, the millions of words that he had seen before began to rapidly reorganize and simplify. The fundamental essence was quickly extracted by him. It was also at this moment that he truly understood the principle behind the divine ability that Luo Fan had taught him. For an existence that had never seen a true divine God power before, this was the first time he had seen such an existence. It simply subverted his view of God power and his concept of God power. For an existence that had never seen a true divine mystique before, this was the first time he had seen a true divine mystique. It had completely subverted his view of mystiques and his concept of mystiques. This true divine God power seemed to have opened a whole new world in front of Guei Shou. He suddenly realized that there was actually such a wonderful existence beyond his understanding. Turned out that God power could also be upgraded to this level. There was actually such a miraculous existence beyond the scope of his knowledge. Turned out that divine abilities could also be raised to this level. At this moment, countless thoughts and ideas flashed in his mind. Countless inspirations flashed in Guei Shou's mind. The countless accumulations in the past seemed to have turned into a true sage magical power and were about to gush out at this moment. Luo Fan looked at the change in Guei Shou's aura. Looking at Guei Shou's expression, he instantly knew that Guei Shou was shocked. He couldn't help but smile faintly. The true divine mystique was a true divine level technique. If it was in other worlds, even if it was a false divine, it would only have the ability to learn. It was impossible to create it. However, this world was different. In this world, the true divine mystery was just like the essence of the world in other worlds, covering all time and space. Under such circumstances, as long as one understood the structure of true divine God power, even if he was a false divine, he could easily create the corresponding true divine God power through the various combinations of the true divine mystery. Under such circumstances, after Guei Shou understood the existence of true divine God power in this world and knew the general structure of true divine God power, it was only natural that he could create the corresponding true divine God power. Of course, this didn't mean that he could immediately create a true divine God power with a certain characteristic. After all, it required an extremely deep understanding of the true divine mysteries and the true divine remarkable powers. It could be said that even the current Luo fan could only barely do it. This turtle's lifespan was still far from that. The current Guei Shou could indeed create a true divine god power by combining many true divine mysteries. However, the function and power of the true divine theurgy that he had created were uncertain. As long as one was a cultivator, the instinct to cultivate had already been deeply engraved in the depths of the origin of life. Luo Fan was no exception, and the current Guei Shou was no exception. Originally, Guei Shou had planned to quickly return to where his main body was after obtaining the true divine god power to pass on the true divine god power. However, after he comprehended the unparalleled existence of the true divine god power, he unknowingly became completely immersed in the mystery of the true divine god power. The matter of leaving had already been unknowingly forgotten in the process. At this moment, all he could think about was the endless combination of the true sage mysteries. At this moment, his mind had unknowingly entered that inexplicable place, reaching the deepest place that he could reach, and began to carefully comprehend the complex combination of the true divine mystery around him. For a moment, he had an epiphany. It turns out that with a little modification, these are already true divine god power. For a moment, his inspiration exploded, and true divine god power after true divine god power was formed in his mind. He waited until he had created hundreds of thousands of true divine theurgy. He sighed helplessly, and his face was full of pain. It was because he had already recovered from that kind of fanaticism, and he really remembered. No matter what he comprehended here, even if he obtained a breakthrough in his nature, he would eventually forget about it after leaving this place. In other words, even if he created hundreds of thousands of true divine magic powers here, he would completely forget about these hundreds of thousands of true divine magic powers after he left this place. What he was doing now was extremely rare. What he was doing now was completely useless. Guei Shou reluctantly let his mind leave that inexplicable place, and the pain on his face became even more intense. Miracle! It didn't happen. He had indeed completely forgotten about the hundreds of thousands of true divine god power that he had created previously. With a slight jolt in his heart, Guei Shou's body suddenly shook, and all the pain on his face disappeared. It was replaced by a kind of anxiety. Oh no, I've stayed here for too long. It was because he had fallen into that kind of fanaticism just now, and his mind had stayed in that inexplicable place for a full 10 years. You've woken up? At this time, Luo Fan's voice rang in his ear. Hearing this, Guei Shou couldn't help but blush and said, I was momentarily obsessed, I'm really ashamed. Luo Fan naturally didn't care about him, and said faintly, Since you've woken up, you can go. At the same time, bring a strand of my will over. I want to meet the person behind the scenes. Guei Shou was overjoyed when he heard this. He was originally secretly worried that the person behind the scenes was on par with Luo Fan. He didn't know if he would accidentally trigger the other party's taboo, so that the other party would exert a blow on him. Now that he heard that Luo Fan was actually willing to let him bring a strand of his will back, it was clear that Luo Fan wanted to intervene. This gave him a boost in confidence, and how could he not be overjoyed? Luo Fan didn't say much, and his heart moved. Naturally, a strand of wool condensed in front of Guei Shou, turning into a faintly discernible point. A faintly discernible light. Guei Shou hurriedly and carefully took the light, bowed to Luo Fan, and turned around to disperse this body. His mind was wrapped in this light, and through the inexplicable connection, directly traversed the endless distance, and returned to the civilized country in the territory of another organization. Although his mind had been away for 10 years, compared with 10 years ago, the creatures he had enlightened and the fate of the country had not changed. They were still calmly cultivating in the small world. After all, it had only been 10 years with a thought, Guei Shou carefully sensed outside the small world. In an instant, He found that the civilized country outside the small world was no different from 10 years ago, and it still looked the same as when he had just left. Feeling all this, Guizhou took a deep breath, and directly stepped out of this small world. Then, when he came to the outside world, he released his aura without hesitation. As a powerful existence comparable to the despaired one's, Guizhou's aura was so powerful that it was almost enough to destroy the world and rebuild the universe. Such a powerful aura was released at this time without reservation. In an instant, this entire civilized country with a radius of hundreds of millions of miles was instantly shrouded under this aura. At this moment, all the creatures with born Taoism aptitude who felt this aura, the protagonists of this country, felt an indescribable childish admiration from the bottom of their hearts. This kind of admiration made all of them clearly understand what kind of existence the owner of this aura was. Of course, this was only for the creatures with born Taoism aptitude. In this country there were tens of millions of enslaved creatures. However, these powerful creatures felt an indescribable pressure, and for a moment, all of them broke free from the power of enslavement that had been placed on them, and began to roar wildly. At this moment, their powerful strength began to be released without reservation, causing the entire country to shake violently. That kind of terrifying power directly broke time and space, instantly plunging this extremely peaceful and prosperous civilized country into the brink of doomsday. Countless screams, roars, and screams could be heard from every corner of this civilized country. How is this possible? There's nothing wrong with my enslavement seed. Why did they break free from my control? This was the magical power that someone had cultivated. This was the roar of a creature with born Taoism aptitude that had condensed into an enslavement seed and controlled a creature. It had been thousands of years since he had cultivated this divine ability. Ever since it had cultivated this magic, it had easily enslaved a powerful creature that was tens of thousands of times more powerful than it was. He had easily enslaved a powerful being that was tens of thousands of times more powerful than him, and with this being, his status had risen countless times compared to before, allowing him to obtain boundless authority. Under such circumstances, it was self-evident how much it valued the creature it had enslaved. Now, all of a sudden, that creature had suddenly broken free from its control. It actually began to release its power without any scruples, destroying time and space, and destroying this country. For a moment, it felt as if it had fallen into a dream. Under this stimulation, he even forgot about the major event of the Creator's arrival. That magic can't actually completely enslave those creatures, Guizhou said at this moment. His voice directly spread throughout the entire civilized country, allowing every creature in it to clearly hear this voice. Beneath this voice, the panic and fear that had originally spread throughout the entire country had diminished a lot at this moment. No matter what, the arrival of its creator meant that they had support behind them, which meant that things had not reached the most desperate situation yet. With a thought in Guizhou's mind, numerous concept cages of nothingness instantly descended. Every creature that was constantly wreaking havoc in time and space, wanting to destroy it, trembled slightly, and all of them were swallowed into the concept cages of nothingness. As they swallowed, all the damage and influence that those creatures had caused to this world and this country was naturally cut off. Naturally, it had been cut off. In an instant, the entire civilized country had already escaped from the brink of doomsday. Then, Guizhou casually grabbed, and the concept cages of nothingness that had been scattered throughout the entire civilized country instantly broke away from their original places, crossing the void, and directly gathering in front of him. They formed a complete concept cage of nothingness. In this concept cage of nothingness, tens of millions of powerful creatures were constantly roaring. They struggled, but they could only watch helplessly as their bodies were eroded by the concept cage of nothingness, turning into nothingness bit by bit. This was the result of Gui's show wanting to investigate these creatures, so he didn't push the concept cage of nothingness to the limit. Otherwise, after staying in there for such a long time, these living beings would have long been turned into nothingness. How could they still maintain their complete appearances? The reason why these creatures could be enslaved by the enslavement seeds is that they have already been planted with restrictions in their bodies. Gui's show explained faintly and no longer spoke about these creatures. After all, there was not much meaning in explaining too much about some things. It was not only because the existence that wanted to seize the fate of this civilized country was still hiding in the background. If he explained too clearly, he would inevitably clash with it. If the other party flew into a rage out of humiliation and wanted to directly destroy this civilized country, it would be very difficult for him to protect this civilized country. In this way, it was obvious that it was better to just give a casual explanation. As for the specifics, he would leave it to those creatures to figure it out themselves. As for whether those creatures could figure out the truth, he didn't doubt this at all. All the creatures in this civilized country had sufficient wisdom, and there were countless existences with rigorous thinking. No matter how complicated the matter was, as long as there were traces, they would eventually find out the truth. At this moment, an angry roar was heard. "Who the hell are you? How dare you want to destroy this country?" Along with this voice, a huge palm stretched out from somewhere in this civilized country and directly pressed down on where Gui's show was. What this palm carried was not pure power, nor was it simply a power that was summoned from that inexplicable place. Instead, it was a concept, a confinement concept that could confine everything. Under this palm was space-time, the mysteries of the true sage, the fragments of the great path, and everything else. They were completely frozen like mosquitoes that had been thrown into amber. Even the changes that should have existed in this world completely disappeared in an instant. Judging from the posture of this palm, it was completely unconcerned about the city that Gui's show was currently in. From the looks of it, not only did it want to completely erase Gui's show from this world, but it also wanted to erase this city from this world. "Finally, you're not pretending anymore?" Gui's show said lightly. As soon as this confinement concept was displayed, there was no longer any doubt about this creature's identity. He could not possibly be a creature with a connate Taoism aptitude from the future. In fact, he could not even be a creature with a connate Taoism aptitude. He could only be an existence that was second only to the strongest commander of some organization. Only in this way could he have the ability to elevate power into a concept. Facing such an existence, Gui's show naturally did not hold back. He had an idea. He raised his hand. In an instant, a concept cage of nothingness appeared out of thin air and directly appeared around that palm. In a flash, it had already wrapped that huge palm. The essence of this concept cage of nothingness was also a concept. And the essence of this palm was also a concept. Obviously, the difference between the two was not enough for either side to easily defeat the other. Therefore, at this moment, the concept cage of nothingness and that palm burst out with an earth-shattering impact. That impact kept reverberating and changing, directly causing the concept cage of nothingness to change its shape. The whole thing looked like a balloon that was forcibly filled with an object that was many times larger than the balloon, and that object was constantly struggling. "Who the hell are you?" At this time, a huge, almost indomitable figure appeared in the void out of thin air, facing Gui's show from a distance. His face was full of shock and anger. When this figure appeared, the surrounding people burst into an uproar. "This is the King of Human, why? I can't believe you stole the King of Human. As such a strong expert, don't you feel ashamed?" Gui's show sighed and said, "Don't talk nonsense," that figure said angrily. "Tell me your name. I am the creator of this world's new main character. Don't you know?" Gui's show said calmly. "Creator? This civilized country was born from nothing in my eyes. Who created it? And you said that I stole the king of human. You directly stole the creator's position. Isn't that even more despicable? That figure sneered. Whether I stole it or not, why don't you ask those creatures? What's true is true, and what's false is false. I believe that if you ask them, you will soon know whether my identity is true or false, Guizhou said calmly, his face not showing the slightest bit of worry. The conversation between the two of them was directly transmitted into the ears of all living beings in this civilized country. In an instant, all the creatures had already made a judgment. When they looked at this king of human, their eyes instantly turned into suspicion. When they looked at Guizhou, they still had the same childish admiration and trust as before. They did not take the king of humans' words to heart. Of course, this was not because they were all so intelligent that they could tell that the king of human was lying and Guizhou was telling the truth. The reason why they behaved like this was very simple. Because after they felt Guizhou's aura, the childish admiration that emerged from the bottom of their hearts directly destroyed all their doubts about Guizhou. This kind of fundamental connection directly acted on the depths of their souls, acting on a gap that had always been somewhat empty since they were born, directly filling up this gap. This, obviously, could not be faked at all. It was precisely because of this that they did not have any doubts at this time. They completely believed that Guizhou was their creator. That king of human was a powerful creature born with innate intelligence in this world in disguise. Naturally, he did not know how they felt about Guizhou. That was why he made such a mistake at this time. Not only did he not drag Guizhou down with him, but he also confirmed to all the creatures that he was a fake. I didn't expect you to be so good at faking. This time I admit defeat, that creature said coldly. Since that's the case, then let this country disappear. As he spoke, he abruptly raised his hands high. In an instant, the faintly discernible, looming, and supreme will that filled the world, as if any strand of it could easily crush the tortoise lifespan and completely eliminate all resistance, was suddenly drawn by him, and actually began to slowly gather between the living being's hands. Chapter 1604. At that moment it was not just all the creatures in the entire country. Even the turtle show felt an inexplicable pressure, as if a catastrophe was about to befall him. His entire body and mind trembled slightly. He can actually condense that willpower. What kind of method is this? How could the owner of that willpower allow his willpower to be controlled by an ant? This thought flashed through the turtle show's mind. If he did not have any other methods, he would not have been able to resist at that moment. He could only watch as that willpower directly crushed him. However, it was clear that he did not have any other methods to deal with this willpower. At that moment, the wisp of willpower that Luo Fan had purposely extracted from his body was stimulated by this powerful willpower and naturally reacted. In an instant, this wisp of willpower suddenly burst out. Almost in the blink of an eye, this willpower had already expanded tens of thousands of times and appeared in the void in the blink of an eye. This willpower instantly swept across the entire civilized country. In an instant, it isolated the pressure emanating from the willpower between the hands of the humanoid king. At that moment, the willpower between the humanoid king's hands trembled slightly, and in the blink of an eye, it had already broken free from the humanoid king's control. The humanoid king had originally wanted to look triumphantly at the turtle show's despairing expression, but he suddenly realized that a willpower that was even more powerful and terrifying than the one he had summoned had surged out of the turtle show's body. Immediately after, the willpower between his hands suddenly broke free from his control. Suddenly, it began to grow in the void and began to transform. This caused the complacent expression on his face to freeze. At that moment, the willpower that was originally controlled between his hands suddenly condensed. In an instant, the endless willpower around him began to rapidly condense, and in the blink of an eye, a strange head was formed in the void. This head looked humanoid, and it even had the charm of a born Taoism aptitude. On top of that, There was an aura that ordinary-born Taoism aptitude creatures could not exude. It was a kind of vicissitude. It was simple and unadorned, as if it had been left behind for countless years. At that moment, the entire civilized country seemed to have paused in time, and all changes came to a standstill in an instant. It wasn't just the living beings with born Taoism aptitude. It wasn't just those ordinary things either. Even the turtle lifespan was affected. Even the human king showed the same reaction. Similarly, he completely stopped at this moment. Following this change, the wisp of Luo Fan's will condensed slightly and condensed into a similarly huge head in the void opposite to the will of Luo Fan. I've never seen you before. That human king used some sort of method to condense his will and said, I am Luo Fan. How should I address you, fellow friend? Luo Fan's will said with a faint smile. Since the will in front of him was able to condense the head of a born Taoism aptitude and was able to create true divine magic, it at least showed that he had already stepped onto the true path of cultivation. However, he was qualified to call Luo Fan a fellow Taoist. The will frowned and said, Luo Fan? I've never heard that name before. You can call me World Emperor. World Emperor? Luo Fan was shocked. Hearing this name, he suddenly remembered the Jin Emperor who sent him here. Both of them were emperors. Was there any connection between them? Could it be that you've heard of my name before? The World Emperor frowned when he saw the change in Luo Fan's expression. No, it's just that I once met a fellow Taoist called the Jin Emperor. I felt that it was somewhat similar, so I was just curious, Luo Fan said with a smile. Jin Emperor? The World Emperor's expression changed drastically as he repeated. Right at this moment, the endless will that filled the boundless void seemed to be stirred up by a powerful force. It suddenly lost its original calm state and fell into chaos. In the blink of an eye, the void within the area covered by the will became dark. It looked as if there was a boundless sky covering the sky. At the same time, the powerful pressure emitted by the will suddenly increased by several times. At this moment, even Luo Fan felt that the surroundings were slightly stagnant, as if he was about to be frozen by the will. At this moment, Luo Fan's real body, who was in a palace hundreds of millions of light years away, suddenly felt an inexplicable pressure acting on his body. In an instant, his face drastically changed. He suddenly understood that although he had made great progress compared to before, he was still inferior to the World Emperor before him. After understanding this, he didn't dare to be careless. He borrowed the mysterious connection between the distant will and his main body and instantly sent his own will over. In an instant, it fused with the will that had already formed his head. In an instant, the head suddenly became several times more solid. Along with this change, the feeling of stagnation that Luo Fan had felt because of the other party's change instantly disappeared. Where did you see the Jin Emperor? The World Emperor's voice was mixed with indescribable pressure. When Luo Fan heard this, he frowned. If the other party asked him nicely, he naturally would not be stingy to tell him. After all, telling the other party where the Jin Emperor was would not affect him. However, at this time, the power in front of him actually used such a condescending and coercive method to ask him, so he had no interest in answering his nonsense. Therefore, he said faintly, "It seems that I asked first. Do you want to die?" The World King was even angrier. In an instant, the entire sky seemed like it was about to collapse. This sentence sounded like the entire world was angry at him. It was using the strongest voice, the angriest, and the most dignified tone to speak. At this time, if the entire civilized country had not been frozen, if the living beings in the civilized country still had some reaction to the outside world, this pressure alone would be enough to make all the living beings in the entire civilized country collapse. All destroyed, facing such a terrifying pressure, Luo Fan smiled coldly. Although he was a little weaker than the creature in front of him, it was only a little. If they fought, he might be beaten back by the opponent. However, it was absolutely impossible for the opponent to use such a simple method to suppress Luo Fan. At this moment, Luo Fan's will spread out, trying hard to mobilize all the existences around him, including time, space, and matter. Energy, including the mysteries of the true divine and the fragments of the great path. Along with, boom, an earth-shattering sound spread throughout the entire civilized country. This was not the sound produced by the collision of power, but the sound produced by the direct collision of willpower. Before this, everything that Luo Fan's willpower controlled was under the opponent's control. Under such circumstances, if Luo Fan's willpower wanted to complete this control, he could only fight under the opponent's control. In other words, he had to defeat the opponent in the collision to be able to truly control everything. The earth-shattering sound that swept through all the space-time in the entire civilized country was the sound produced by the collision of willpower. This sound did not reach the real world. It only sounded at the level of willpower. If there was a creature with a complete willpower to sense all of this at this time, it would find that this vibration was directly transmitted to its life source, and it might even directly destroy its life source in the vibration. Obviously it was. Here, there was no creature with a complete willpower to observe all the changes that were happening. They had already been frozen in this civilized country, therefore. These various changes only appeared at the level of the willpower of Luo Fan and the owner of the willpower. At this moment, both of them felt their minds shake, and almost at the same time, they felt as if their own willpower and their life source were about to collapse. The World King obviously did not expect that Luo Fan would actually clash with him so forcefully. After all, this was his territory. Luo Fan was definitely in a disadvantageous position here. Normal people would definitely tuck their tails between their legs at this time. How could he fight with him for control of the surroundings so forcefully? It was precisely because he did not expect this in advance that the World King fell into a disadvantageous position in the willpower battle just now. In an instant, the various drastic changes that occurred because of his anger had completely disappeared. What replaced it was a peaceful and calm appearance under Luo Fan's control. The World King paused for a moment and suddenly said, "You have some strength, but it's not enough for me to take you seriously." At this moment, an indescribably terrifying power was produced out of thin air, instantly sweeping through the surrounding space-time within a range of billions of miles. After this power swept through, the surrounding world began to change out of thin air. In the blink of an eye, before Luo Fan could react, he found that his willpower had arrived at a completely unfamiliar place. A place between heaven and earth and nothingness. Here, he could see everything in the normal space-time, and he could also sense that inexplicable existence. It seemed as if he had suddenly arrived at a place between the normal space-time and that inexplicable existence. However, there was a huge difference between this position and the mysterious existence that Gui Shou had constructed here. The strange existence that Gui Shou had created was at most equivalent to building an extremely flat plane between the normal space-time and the inexplicable existence. However, the one in front of him was like a fusion of the two, directly combining into a strange world with the characteristics of both. Here, the head that was condensed from willpower shook slightly, and it had already twisted into a figure that looked not much different from a normal human figure. The face of this figure was no different from the face of the head that was condensed from willpower. Luo Fan's heart moved, and he felt the uniqueness of this world. Here, his willpower did not need to be transformed, and it naturally transformed into a physical entity. Just like at this moment, although he did not want to transform his willpower into a physical entity, the head that was condensed from willpower was already rapidly transforming into a physical state. If he delayed for a little longer, it would become a real one. An incomparably gigantic solid head appeared. At this moment, Luo Fan sensed that something was amiss and hurriedly focused his will. In an instant, The will that was originally in the form of a giant head condensed into the form of a normal body. Then, due to the characteristics of this world, this body naturally turned into a body of flesh and blood. I won't ask where your main body is. Since you've appeared with your will, I'll fight you with my will. As long as you can remain undefeated in front of me, you can ask whatever you want. I'll answer you. But, if you lose, you must tell me everything I want to know, said the Will of the World King. Hearing this, Luo Fan's expression changed slightly. How could he be so confident? However, since he had already come this far, he naturally could not back down. He smiled faintly at this moment. Bring it on. The World Emperor didn't say much. He suddenly raised his hand and slapped towards Luo Fan's will. At this moment, an indescribably strong sense of crisis surged in his heart. Then, he felt that an endless concept of destruction was born out of thin air and began to attack him rapidly. This concept of destruction was stronger and more condensed than any concept that Luo Fan had ever seen before. Under this concept, everything in the surroundings, including the space-time and the endless mysteries of the true divine, was filled with them. The fragments of the great Tao, and even the deeper and more mysterious existences, were completely destroyed by this concept at this moment. At other times, it could completely break space-time and reveal the state of chaos. This was already an attack that had reached the limit. However, at this moment, right here, just the concept of destruction that was released by the will in front of him had completely destroyed everything, revealing the state of chaos hidden behind this world. Everything looked so mysterious, so violent, and so dangerous. Facing such a concept of destruction, how could Luo Fan dare to be careless? He quickly communicated with that inexplicable place. With a thought, a wave of power descended and also turned into a concept of destruction that blasted towards the opponent's concept of destruction. When two similar concepts collided, the final result was, of course, to see which of the two concepts was stronger and more terrifying. Because the pressure that the World Emperor in front of him brought him was too strong. Therefore, at this moment, the strength of the concept of destruction that Luo Fan released was not any weaker than the opponent's. In this collision, the two concepts of destruction shattered almost at the same time. Countless fragments of the concept of destruction covered the sky and covered the earth in all directions. Although the destruction concept had already crumbled into countless specks of light, its might was still extremely impressive. Everything around the destruction concept was constantly being destroyed and crumbled. In the end, it revealed a grayish chaotic state that started to spread out bit by bit, as if it had been dyed by the destruction concept. Fortunately, this world was incompatible with the primal chaos. Even if everything had been destroyed, as long as the world itself was not completely destroyed, the primal chaos would not be able to enter this world and would not be able to truly harm anything in this world. In other words, even at this moment, the state of chaos around the concept of destruction could be seen. However, it could only be seen and couldn't be touched at all. There was no need to worry that the state of chaos would continue to spread and eventually destroy everything. Using basic concepts to fight was perhaps the strongest means for existences like Guai Shou. But for existences like Luo Fan, this was only the most basic. At this moment, both of them moved at the same time. As they raised their hands and gently waved, the countless scattered concepts of destruction quickly condensed in an instant and rapidly transformed. In the blink of an eye, it had turned into countless different concepts that were even opposite to each other. After these concepts were formed, they began to rapidly combine. What Luo Fan combined was a world composed of all kinds of concepts. As for the World Emperor, he transformed into a huge axe. The blade of the axe was the concept of sharpness. After the concept of sharpness, it was the concept of destruction. After that, it was the concept of firmness. In this way, layers of concepts were nested and combined, finally forming this axe. It was like the most powerful axe in the universe. able to unfold and destroy everything. The conceptual world formed by Luo Fan with the help of countless concepts wasn't considered big. After appearing, it directly collided with the Emperor. Seeing the world colliding with him, the Emperor wasn't moved at all. The axe in his hand that was composed of various concepts flew into the air. In a flash, it drew a trajectory that seemed to be able to destroy the state of chaos and directly slashed into the conceptual world. Puff, after a muffled sound, the axe directly slashed into the conceptual world. It directly slashed into the conceptual world and instantly opened up a deep crack in the conceptual world. A long, big crack appeared. It seemed that Luo Fan had fallen into the lowest point of his life. However, at this moment, in the concept world, countless concept creatures began to quickly pounce towards the axe. One by one, they burst out with all kinds of powerful attacks, constantly attacking the powerful axe. There seemed to be no comparison between the concept creatures and the axe. The gap between the concept creatures and the axe was extremely huge. It seemed like the concept creatures couldn't hurt the axe no matter what they did. However, this common sense couldn't be applied here. The reason for this was none other than the fact that the axe was made up of concepts. These concept creatures were also condensed from various concepts. In the eyes of the living creature, the conceptual axe was like a flesh axe in the eyes of an ordinary living creature. Those concept creatures, however, they could easily destroy the concepts on the concept axe. Then, slowly, they disintegrated the concept axe bit by bit, causing the concept axe that had deeply slashed into the conceptual world to be continuously damaged, continuously shrinking in the end, after a short while. All the parts of the concept axe that had slashed into the conceptual world were completely broken down by the concept creatures. All the concepts were instead digested by the conceptual world, causing the conceptual world to improve greatly. At this moment, the World Emperor's expression became extremely unsightly. With a wave of his hand, the concept axe was retrieved by him. However, the changes on the concept axe were visible to the naked eye. On the concept axe, a huge crack appeared out of thin air. Moreover, the missing part of the gap was extremely irregular. It was clear that there was some kind of extremely tiny existence cutting it or even gnawing on it to create such a change. The World Emperor's expression kept changing as he looked at the concept axe. After a long while, he finally said, "You are qualified to be my Tao friend since you were able to make this concept creature gain sentience." It was obvious that he had acknowledged Luo Fan's strength and that Luo Fan was qualified to treat him as an equal. Just as Luo Fan was about to say something to ease the tension, the World Emperor's expression suddenly changed again. He said, "However, you are still far from being able to remain undefeated in front of me." As he spoke, he shook the concept axe in his hand. In an instant, the missing parts of the concept axe completely disappeared. The entire concept axe was restored to its original appearance. Then, he raised his axe and exerted force. A large axe shadow flashed past, directly crossing the void, and suddenly chopped down on the conceptual world that Luo Fan had condensed. Luo Fan's eyesight was amazing. He could see every trace of the axe shadow at a glance. The traces were extremely mysterious and profound, as if they contained the traces of all the martial arts in the universe. He couldn't help but be secretly amazed. He didn't expect the World Emperor in front of him to have studied martial arts to such a deep level. However, it was obvious that in terms of martial arts attainments, Luo Fan was confident that he wouldn't be inferior to anyone. Therefore, at this moment, with a thought in his mind, the concept world trembled slightly. Like a meteor hammer, it was swung by him, displaying all kinds of hammer techniques that contained the truth of the universe, directly colliding with the axe shadow. The concept axe and the conceptual world were unimaginably powerful existences. Under normal circumstances, even if the world outside withstood the impact without holding back, the world within a radius of billions of miles would definitely be completely turned into powder. It would take a long time for the world to repair itself. Chapter 1605. Fawn color equals red, squinting eyes face. B. In this strange space-time, the two of them unleashed their martial arts attainments without holding back. As they moved, everything in this space-time seemed to have turned into dough. Following their movements, all sorts of extremely chaotic changes occurred. In this battle, the arc of the axe in the Realm King's hand seemed to split the sky and earth, directly splitting everything. As Luo Fan's concept world swung like a round hammer, it also displayed the supreme principle of the universe. As he moved, the chaos in this space-time continued to advance to a deeper level, constantly evolving. As the two of them fought to their heart's content, the axe suddenly collided with the concept world without holding back. Although the axe cut deeply into the concept world, the various changes in the concept world completely devoured the axe blade at the same time, completely mincing it, causing the axe to lose a part of itself. There were even concept creatures that directly went up through the concept axe and pounced towards the Realm King. The Realm King raised his hand slightly and a mysterious force erupted from his axe, directly mincing the concept creatures that had pounced into the axe and wanted to attack the Realm King along the axe. In the blink of an eye, all of the creatures disappeared without a trace. At this moment, the axe had already been retracted. "Take another move from me!" the Realm King suddenly roared. Following this roar, the concept axe in his hand suddenly emitted endless light. Following this roar, the concept axe in his hand suddenly emitted endless light. This kind of light surpassed the concept, but it contained an extremely deep and indescribable charm. It belonged to an extremely deep, indescribable charm that belonged to ordinary space-time. It was supreme and had the power to crush and destroy everything. However, when anyone shifted their gaze away, they would instantly forget about its existence and all the changes that it had just made. Everything it had changed. This kind of light spread in spacetime. In an instant, it engulfed the entire spacetime, causing everything in this spacetime to be changed by this light. Under this change, everything in this space-time suddenly had the characteristics of this light. An incomparably terrifying pressure began to erupt from all directions at this moment. It crazily crushed Luo Fan, constantly attacking his body's defense. Even the concept world in front of him seemed to become heavy under this light. All the concepts in it seemed to have a gap between them, and there seemed to be a barrier. The reason why these concepts could form this concept world was because of the changes between many concepts. Now, there were gaps and barriers in this flow. How could this concept world take shape? In an instant, countless tiny concept fragments began to disperse from the concept world. They looked like stars in the sky. They looked like little stars showing a cruel beauty, so strong. Luo Fan just stared at the light and thought. At this moment, he clearly saw that after the light was released, the concept axe had collapsed. All of the concepts within it dissipated at a speed faster than the concept world in Luo Fan's hand. If the concept world in Luo Fan's hand had only collapsed into countless small concept fragments, then at this moment, the axe in the Realm King's hand had already collapsed like a fountain. The small and dense fragments formed a large area, crazily rushing in all directions. Moreover, this was not the full price that the Realm King had to pay for using this method. At this time, the Realm King's real body paid the price. At this time, the real body of the Realm King had to pay the price. At least, in this space-time, his real body appeared. Under this light, the Realm King's body seemed to be made of sand. Starting from his head, countless small fragments started to slowly flow down from there. At first glance, it was obvious that his body was gradually disintegrating. This light was extremely terrifying. It directly oppressed Luo Fan's will, making his will feel the pressure of countless worlds. Under this pressure, the internal structure of his body began to collapse. Little by little, his body began to be swallowed by this light. Even though he tried his best to condense all sorts of concepts to resist the pressure of this light and resist the devouring of this light, none of them worked in the end. In the end, his body was still moving towards the end, towards destruction. At this moment, as his body was moving towards the end, Luo Fan's heart didn't feel any despair, and he didn't even have many negative emotions. All he had was a kind of inexplicable joy and excitement. Of course, this wasn't because he was a masochist, but because in the changes of this light, he saw another kind of change after the concept power was guided from an inexplicable place. Compared to the little bit of willpower that existed here, compared to the outcome of his battle with the Realm King, this kind of harvest was what he wanted to see the most. It could be said that regardless of whether he won or lost this time, whether the Realm King had to answer his question or he had to answer the Realm King's question, he was already satisfied. He already felt that coming here this time was worth it. Of course, even though he didn't really care whether he won or lost, it didn't mean that he was willing to admit defeat. Who wouldn't want victory? Therefore, at this time, he was trying his best to find a way to resist this light. If he wanted to defeat the Realm King, he didn't need to completely resist this light, nor did he need to destroy it. He just needed to survive before the Realm King's body completely collapsed and disappeared. This mysterious light was clearly not something that a world king could withstand. At least, it was not something that his willpower here could withstand. The Realm King, using such a method, required him to pay an extremely terrible price. It required him to pay the price of destroying his own will in order to achieve this. This was what he needed to do. Obviously, this gave Luo Fan a chance. During this process, Luo Fan tried his best to use his wisdom to sense the surrounding light in an incomparably meticulous manner. He tried his best to study the characteristics of this light, and to comprehend how this light was sublimated from a concept. Of course, this wasn't a simple matter. After all, it was a light that already had that inexplicable characteristic. With Luo Fan's current state of being unable to retain even the slightest bit of his memories from that inexplicable place, wanting to comprehend the characteristics of this light was, of course, an almost impossible thing, even if he had sensed it at that time. After studying it clearly, when he turned his gaze away, it was then that he realized that all of his previous senses and all of his research had been for naught. Everything. He had completely forgotten about them. After studying it for a while, when half of his body had completely disappeared, Luo Fan finally confirmed this point. He couldn't help but sigh, knowing that it was impossible to deduce the method to improve the concept from the finished product. He could only sigh helplessly. At this time, he turned his gaze to the center of the light, staring at the Realm King. He looked. He saw that the Realm King's body had only consumed less than 1/3 of its energy. That speed, compared to him, who had consumed nearly half of his body, the speed of collapse was obviously much slower. In other words, if this went on, he would definitely lose. Understanding this, Luo Fan's eyes narrowed. He knew that it wouldn't work if this went on. Countless thoughts flashed through his mind, thinking about how to deal with this situation. The power of the light was earth-shattering. This strange spacetime had completely turned into a sea of light in this process. Only the state of chaos that was hidden behind, or rather, outside of this world, could be preserved under the illumination of this light. In other words, it could still be seen in this world. Apart from this, everything else, including time, space, matter, energy, true divine mystery, great Tao fragments, and everything else, had completely disappeared at this time, completely drawn into the light. This included the concept world that Luo Fan had condensed. Of course, it was not an easy task to block this light. Countless thoughts flashed through Luo Fan's mind, and countless methods emerged. Then, in the next moment, these countless thoughts were overturned by him. These methods might indeed be effective in a certain aspect, but they all had a huge flaw, causing them to be unable to be used to resist this light. As he continued to think, time gradually passed. The effect of the light also became stronger and stronger. The assimilation and devouring of Luo Fan's body also became more and more frequent. Unknowingly, Luo Fan's will was only left with an extremely small dot, a dot that was billions of times smaller than the tip of a needle. At this time, only 80% of the World Emperor's body had turned into nothingness. It could be said that if this went on, the next moment, the one who would lose would obviously be Luo Fan. At this moment, a light flashed through Luo Fan's mind. An inexplicable light was emitted from the last bit of his will that he had left. This light was extremely mysterious, and it was even more mysterious and unparalleled. It had a sense of eternity and indestructibility, and it seemed to be on the same level as the surrounding light that covered the entire spacetime. However, its nature was completely different, and it could even be said to be the complete opposite. It was completely different from the surrounding light that would be forgotten after seeing it. Now, the light emitted by Luo Fan's will gave an incomparably deep impression. Anyone who saw it, no matter how long it had been, would definitely remember all its details. Such a similar nature of the light had already opened up a small area in the surrounding boundless light as soon as it appeared, forming an incomparably solid defensive layer that blocked the surrounding boundless light. No matter how the light attacked and crushed, in the end, it could not continue to hurt Luo Fan's will in the center. When the surrounding light was displayed, it had an incomparably huge pressure on the will, so much so that the World Emperor had to destroy his own will in order for the light to appear. However, the light emitted by Luo Fan's will was completely different. Not only did it not cause any pressure on the will. On the contrary, it had extraordinary benefits for the will. Under the shroud of the light, Luo Fan had originally been swallowed and assimilated to the point where only a tiny bit of will was left. At this time, it was as if he had taken a great tonic, and began to grow at an extremely crazy speed. In just a few short breaths, it had already grown from a size that was originally hundreds of millions of times smaller than the tip of a needle to the size of a needle tip. Then, after a short while, it had already grown to the size of a thumb, the size of a palm, the size of an arm. In the end, under the World Emperor's incredulous gaze, Luo Fan's will, it had completely restored its original appearance, becoming incomparably real. The complete Luo Fan came out, quietly floating in the eternal and indestructible light. These two lights, one big and one small, both were lights that could not be described with normal colors. However, although they could not be described with colors, the light was still completely different. The boundary between the two was extremely obvious. The light emitted from Luo Fan's body did not expand endlessly. Instead, it maintained the state of only wrapping his body, quietly defending against the surrounding light's invasion. Although the surrounding light attacked and suppressed with all its might, wanting to crush the light around Luo Fan's body, in the end, it had no effect at all. It could not hurt the light at all. It could not even make the light deform in the slightest. "What is this light?" The World Emperor finally let out an incredulous voice. After this, all the light dissipated. As the light dissipated, the World Emperor's body also disappeared, as well as this entire strange space-time. This was because the World Emperor's will had been exhausted at this time, and finally could no longer maintain the existence of the light. The light dissipated, and space-time disappeared. Luo Fan's will naturally returned to the normal space-time, and directly came to the country where the turtle life was. At this moment, when the entire civilized country was about to break out of its frozen state, the surrounding endless will began to condense. It transformed into a huge head, appearing in front of Luo Fan. This was the head of the World Emperor. Luo Fan looked at the light around him, feeling the same comfortable feeling as when he was in the strange space-time. In his heart, he had a new understanding of the characteristics of the light. Originally, without the protection of the light, if his will returned to the normal space-time, it would definitely be like the World Emperor's will. It would not be easy to condense a human figure with flesh and blood. It could only condense a huge, illusory head in the void. However, at this moment, under the protection of the light around him, His will felt extremely comfortable. He did not have to exert any effort at all, and he had already maintained the physical state that he could only maintain when he was in the mysterious spacetime. What is this light? After the World Emperor appeared, he did not attack, but directly asked. I also do not know what this light is. However, it comes from my heart, from my life origin, Luo Fan said with a faint smile. When saying this, Luo Fan had an indescribable feeling in his heart. This kind of light did indeed come from his soul, from the origin of his life. However, the most fundamental reason why he could refine this light was because of his realm origin. Previously, when his will was about to be annihilated and he was about to completely fail, a light suddenly flashed in his heart, and he suddenly comprehended a bit of the key to the realm origin. In an instant, with his own worldview as the foundation, he combined his understanding of all the mysteries of the true saint together, and in the end, this inexplicable light was produced. The realm origin and the inexplicable existence are existences of the same level. If the World Emperor can refine this kind of light from the inexplicable existence, he should be able to refine a similar light from the realm origin. I didn't expect that. I almost forgot about my own origin. At this time, Luo Fan was secretly reflecting on himself. Ever since he stepped into this world, the inexplicable existence that could release an inexplicable power that could increase the various abilities of living beings by countless times had rushed towards him at lightning speed. This caused him to unknowingly focus his attention on this inexplicable existence. Unknowingly, he had put aside the realm origin that could truly increase his cultivation realm. He waited until just now. At the last moment when his will was about to be crushed, a light flashed in his heart, and he grasped this key point. Then, he turned all his past understanding of the realm origin into the light, and then refined this light. The World Emperor naturally didn't know that Luo Fan's emotions were fluctuating. When he heard Luo Fan's words, he seemed to be in deep thought. After a while, he sighed and said, "This time I lost. What requests do you have?" Hearing this, Luo Fan calmed himself down. He didn't say any nonsense like he was lucky. After all, for existences of their level, a loss was a loss. A win was a win. Even if he lied about being lucky, the World Emperor wouldn't be in a good mood because of this. A win was a win. Even if he lied about being lucky, the World Emperor wouldn't be in a good mood even if he was in a bad mood. If his mood wasn't affected, these words would naturally be even more meaningless. Thus, he directly said, "First, I want to ask you, is it your plan to seize the fate of the new main character of this world?" Hearing this, the World Emperor said indifferently, "Although that divine ability was created by me, it seizes the fate of the main character's race. This is the idea of one of my subordinate." When Luo Fan heard this, he slightly gestured to the human monarch who was frozen in the void. Yes. The World Emperor didn't hide anything. So that's how it is. In that case, please don't interfere in the battle for the fate of this civilized country. Luo Fan nodded. If seizing the fate of the main character was the World Emperor's idea, then things would probably be a little troublesome. Although the World Emperor asked him to make a request, it didn't mean that he could make any request. For some small requests, the World Emperor naturally wouldn't be stingy with keeping his promise. However, if this request involved the other party's cultivation and big plan, then, he obviously wouldn't care about the promise. And obviously, if the one seizing the fate of the main character was the World Emperor, then it meant that this was a big plan for the World Emperor. In this case, if Luo Fan made this request, it would directly make the World Emperor fall out with him. Only if this plan was not the World Emperor but someone else, this request would be considered a small request. Only then would the World Emperor keep his promise. The World Emperor thought for a while and said, "Okay. However, you can't interfere either." Luo Fan naturally didn't care and said, "Of course." Hearing Luo Fan agree, the World Emperor said, "Since we have already agreed on this, I wonder if you can tell me where you met the Gene Emperor?" At this time, he was no longer as arrogant as he was at the beginning. Instead, he asked with an equal attitude. He already had no right to ask this question when he failed. However, he still asked it now, which showed how much he cared about this question. Luo Fan didn't go too far. The reason why he didn't answer before was because he was unhappy with the Gene Emperor's attitude. He didn't want to help the Gene Emperor keep her secret. Now that the Gene Emperor's attitude had softened, he naturally didn't need to be angry anymore. Therefore, he said with a smile, "I don't know much. When I met her, it was in another world." Another world? Hearing this, the Gene Emperor looked anxious and said, "I wonder if you know how to enter another world?" "I don't know. I was sent to this world by the Gene Emperor in some way. I really don't know how to leave," Luo Fan said. Hearing this, the World Emperor couldn't help but feel a little disappointed. Obviously, what he really cared about was not the Gene Emperor, but how to enter the world that the Gene Emperor entered. If it was before, the World Emperor would have caught Luo Fan and interrogated him, or directly read his memory. However, it was obviously not like before. Just now, Luo Fan had directly shown his powerful strength to the World Emperor. At this time, he could only forcibly swallow the doubts in his heart and said, "Thank you for telling me all this. It's nothing. It's a pity that I can't help you." Luo Fan said with a smile, "I wonder if I can ask one more question. What is the identity of the Gene Emperor? Is he your enemy or friend?" Chapter 1606. Fawn B. I didn't expect it to be like this. Luo Fan was both surprised and enlightened. He was surprised because the Realm King was a good friend of the Gene Emperor, but he was enlightened because of the Gene Emperor's identity. Perhaps only someone with such a status in this strange world could easily send him to this world. The Realm King didn't ask Luo Fan where he came from, but he already knew where he was. Luo Fan's heart moved a little, and he already understood that the original territory of this big organization was probably the original territory of the Gene Emperor. As for the powerhouse who controlled this territory now, he should have risen after the Gene Emperor left, or he just came here from somewhere else to occupy this territory. If that was the case, then the situation would make sense. For example, the Realm King was obviously the ruler of this area, and the Gene Emperor was his good friend. The most likely place where the Gene Emperor lived was naturally next to the Realm King's territory, and the territory of the big organization was obviously next to the Realm King's territory. Another example was that the powerhouse must have a very high control over his own territory. When Luo Fan was sent to this world, he appeared in the territory of the big organization, which meant that the Gene Emperor had a very high control over this area, so it was very likely that this was his territory. At this time, the Realm King said, "Let's forget about this matter. If you have time in the future, you can come to my cave residence for a visit. I believe that fellow Taoist should be able to find my abode by now." After hearing this, Luo Fan nodded and said, "I will go there. Goodbye," the Realm King said faintly. After saying that, the huge head shook and disappeared without a trace, completely turning into nothingness. At the same time, the terrifying pressure that shrouded the entire civilized country disappeared in an instant. Everything in the whole civilized country that was originally frozen was restored in an instant. Everything seemed to be the same as before. At this time, the human king's horrified expression finally disappeared. The joy on Guizhou's face had yet to fully emerge. During the battle between the wills of Emperor Jin and Luo Fan, the terrifying pressure not only solidified everything on the surface, but also the wills of all living beings. His mind and thoughts were frozen. Therefore, at this moment, the many living beings were still frozen in the instant before they were frozen. At this moment, they suddenly recovered. After a while, they noticed that the situation around them had changed. It was only then that he noticed Luo Fan, who was wrapped in some kind of mysterious light in midair. "Greetings, master." Gui Shou noticed Luo Fan and quickly bowed in salute. At the moment the turtle bowed, everyone in the entire civilized country bowed at the same time. However, compared to the Gui Shou who knew who Luo Fan was, those living beings only followed the Gui Shou and had no idea who they were worshipping. However, no matter what, he had already made a respectful gesture. At this moment, when the human king saw Luo Fan, he couldn't help but reveal a horrified expression on his face. His heart moved. He turned around and flew into the distance. He didn't want to stay here for even a moment. Seeing this, Luo Fan pointed with his finger. In an instant, an inexplicable force directly pressed down on the human king, directly freezing his entire body. Even his thoughts were completely frozen, causing him to fall into the state where his will was frozen in the blink of an eye. After doing this, Luo Fan then let Gui Shou get up. Gui Shou stood up and came in front of Luo Fan to listen to his teachings. Seeing this, Luo Fan said indifferently, "I've already made an agreement with the expert behind the scenes. He won't interfere in the affairs of this civilized country anymore. Everything will depend on the results of your own battles." Hearing this, Gui Shou couldn't help but be overjoyed and said, "Thank you, master." To Gui Shou, what Luo Fan said was indeed a great thing. There was no other reason other than the immense will that was faintly discernible in the void. The pressure it gave him was simply too strong. Under this kind of pressure, he was constantly worried that his actions would anger the owner of the will. He was constantly worried that the will would suddenly condense and easily take his life. It was precisely because of this that he became so cautious after entering this civilized country and couldn't let go of his hands and feet. Now that he had obtained Luo Fan's promise, he suddenly felt comfortable as if he had broken free from all barriers and shackles. The carefree feeling he had when he was in other civilized countries in the past returned to him at this moment. "All right, I'll leave the rest to you. Do your best," Luo Fan said indifferently. As he spoke, the light around his body began to gradually fade. During this process, his body also began to gradually collapse. When the light completely disappeared, his body also completely collapsed, directly turning into an invisible will. With a slight tremble, through the mysterious connection between the will and his body, he instantly traversed through time and space and returned to where his body was, disappearing in front of everyone in this civilized country. The moment Luo Fan left, the power that froze the human king instantly disappeared. The human king recovered in the blink of an eye. The method that Luo Fan used to freeze the human king in front of him was the same as the method he and the realm king used to freeze the entire civilized country. Therefore, at this moment, his thoughts were still in the same state as when he was frozen. In other words, run in a flash, his figure had already traversed countless light years, directly disappearing from the sight of this civilized country. In that instant, the world king's will condensed slightly, and he had already transmitted a thought to the human king. After receiving this will, the human king's face suddenly relaxed. It was just like how Gui Shou was extremely afraid of the realm king. This human king was also extremely afraid of Luo Fan. The reason why he left so decisively was because the pressure that Luo Fan brought him made him feel as if his life could be directly erased in the next moment. And now, after hearing the message from the Realm King's will, he truly knew that Luo Fan would not interfere in their matters. Naturally, he completely relaxed. The thoughts that were previously suppressed by the powerful pressure from Luo Fan resurfaced, and he was unwilling to leave just like that. He directly stopped at a distance that was unknown how many light years away from this civilized country. With a thought, he suddenly raised his hand and grabbed at the void. In an instant, an indescribable power descended from the sky from that inexplicable place, directly turning into a confusing concept in the void. It directly confused space and time, and in an extremely strange manner. It directly descended on that civilized country, fiercely pressing down on Gui Shou. The moment this confusing concept descended, Gui Shou already sensed it. With a thought, he instantly spread out the concept of nothingness. All of a sudden, it suddenly turned into a huge palm, instantly grabbing at that confusing concept. This palm was condensed with the strongest concept of nothingness that he could control. This concept of nothingness could turn everything into nothingness, including time and space, the mysteries of true sage, and the great path fragment. And all of this turned into nothingness. Obviously, the only thing that the confusing concept could confuse was obviously nothingness. Therefore, at this moment, this confusing concept directly collided with the palm of the concept of nothingness. In an instant, confusion and nothingness reacted with each other. Another kind of existence was born. Sound at this moment. Rumble when the two collided, endless loud noises began to spread in all directions, directly causing the whole city to begin to tremble violently. Even many of the originally not very strong buildings in the city began to collapse in this tremor. They began to break, resulting in an astonishing destructive effect. Gui Shou's strength was not much stronger than that human king's. But, at this moment, the concept of nothingness released by Gui Shou had the upper hand. Under the influence of the concept of nothingness, the confusing concept trembled, gradually collapsed, and gradually was destroyed. In a short while, it completely disappeared. In the end, it only damaged some of the buildings in the city that had been skimped on. The reason for this was very simple. It was because Gui Shou was the creator of all the creatures in this civilized country recognized by heaven and earth. When such an existence was acknowledged as the creator by all living beings, he would naturally receive the blessing of the heavens and the earth. Naturally, he would be able to display extraordinary abilities. Just like now, he, who had the probability of winning, could naturally greatly increase this probability, and thus get rid of his opponent more easily. Faced with this situation, the human king was obviously unwilling to accept it, and it was impossible for him to give up so easily. At this moment, he roared loudly. With a light step, he easily crossed a distance of who knew how many billions of light years and directly arrived in front of Gui Shou. As his body condensed, it was wrapped by a concept of rapid destruction, forming a huge humanoid shadow. He raised his hand and blasted a punch at Gui Shou. This punch was not blasted horizontally. Instead, it blasted down from above. Under the shroud of this punch, space-time, the mysteries of the true sage, the fragments of the great path, and even the city below began to show signs of destruction. Compared to the chaotic concept from before, this destruction concept wasn't much stronger. However, since the human king was already here, his control over the destruction concept and the power of the destruction concept wasn't something the human king could compare to before. At this moment, Gui Shou felt a sense of danger that he had not felt for a long time. With a thought, he did not hesitate to slightly turn the palm of the concept of nothingness that he had condensed before. He clenched it into a fist and directly faced the punch of the concept of destruction. Gui Shou had mastered the concept of nothingness the most and had the best control over it. Therefore, as long as he could use the concept of nothingness to deal with an attack, he would instinctively use the concept of nothingness to deal with it. Fortunately, the concept of nothingness was an almost universal response. No matter what kind of attack or concept it was, as long as it was transformed into nothingness, it would naturally not be able to cause any harm. The fist formed by the concept of nothingness directly collided with the fist formed by the concept of destruction. A strong wave burst out at the point of contact. In an instant, a world formed by countless waves was created. Then, it was instantly destroyed by the next wave, and the next wave quickly turned into a world of wave. Then, the rippling world was destroyed in the next instant, and so on. The cycle changed in a way that almost exceeded the limits of any living being's ability to react, displaying an inconceivable and shocking scene. If such waves were ignored, they would inevitably cause shocking damage to this civilized country. However, it was obvious that this would not happen. At this moment, the many living beings that Guay Shou had enlightened also took action. At the same time, the living beings formed by the destiny of the nation also took action. All kinds of divine abilities were instantly released by them. In just an instant, they firmly protected the entire civilized country from top to bottom. Although the many terrifying waves did not disappear and were still attacking everything around them, in the end, they did not cause any damage to the entire civilized country. Everything was destroyed. However, they were all limited to the many divine abilities and powers that protected the entire civilized country. The many divine abilities and powers collapsed and were destroyed in an instant, but they were instantly replenished. Just like that, an extremely fast cycle of life and death was formed. In the end, with great difficulty, the destruction of the waves on the civilized country was stopped. It also saved the living beings in the civilized country from the fate of being completely killed by the waves. And in order to achieve this, it had to. At this moment, the thousands of living beings enlightened by Guay Shou, including the kingdom's luck, had poured all their energy into the battle to block the remnant energy that leaked out from the battle between Guay Shou and the human king. Every single one of them had used all their strength. Without this worry, Guay Shou finally completely let go of everything. With a thought, his figure flashed. Wrapped by the concept of nothingness, he forcefully crashed into the human king, who was enveloped by the concept of destruction. As for the collision between the fist formed by the concept of destruction and the fist formed by the concept of nothingness, he no longer cared about it. When the human king saw Guay Shou crash into him, a cold smile appeared on his face. His body shook slightly, and in the blink of an eye, he had already turned into a 6-armed gorilla. It was a 6-armed gorilla that was over 100 feet tall, and its entire body seemed to be forged from steel. This was obviously his true body. Facing Guay Shou, the 6-armed gorilla did not retreat at all. Instead, it took the initiative to crash into Guay Shou. Crack! A shocking tremor mixed with the terrifying waves spread out as the collision occurred. The terrifying waves instantly caused all the living beings that were protecting the civilized country to spit out blood. It even caused the divine powers and powers that they had used to protect the entire civilized nation to be instantly damaged beyond repair. At this moment, all the concepts of nothingness and concept of destruction were shattered. Countless fragments of the concepts scattered everywhere, causing the entire void to become broken like a sieve. At this moment, Guay Shou's body had already collided with the 6-armed gorilla without any reservations. The 6-armed gorilla's body was over 30 meters tall, and the muscles all over its body seemed to be made of diamond. Compared to Guay Shou, who looked no different from an ordinary person, it was simply too powerful. However, under such circumstances, the result of the collision was unexpected. The one who won was Guay Shou. During the collision, the 6-armed gorilla's body caved in at a speed visible to the naked eye. Immediately afterward, blood frantically gushed out from its many apertures and pores, and one could even see pieces of internal organs being spat out. How is this possible? The 6-armed gorilla screamed in horror. Because Guay Shou won, at this moment, the concepts of nothingness and concept of destruction that were shattered due to the collision naturally rose up and directly shot towards the back of the 6-armed gorilla. It looked like a dishwasher that came out of the water and directly sprayed towards the 6-armed gorilla. Fortunately, this was the case. Therefore, not many of the concept fragments fell down, and there was not much possibility of them harming the civilized country. Even the small number of concept fragments that fell down and might harm the civilized nation were blocked by the nation's fate and the living beings with great difficulty. Guay Shou naturally didn't need to answer the 6-armed gorilla that he was once a turtle. The hardness of his body was even stronger than that of the 6-armed gorilla. Now that he had the upper hand, he was unforgiving. He suddenly shrank back. He suddenly retracted his body and slammed into the body of the six-armed gorilla again, causing the body of the six-armed gorilla to emit cracking sounds. The speed at which blood gushed out became even faster. Like this, the six-armed gorilla's body was battered and almost turned into minced meat. As for Guai Shou's actions, there was not the slightest hesitation. His eyes were full of determination. It was a firm resolution to his actions. At this time, seeing Guai Shou's expression and feeling the impact that was enough to shatter his body, the six-armed gorilla finally couldn't bear it anymore. The six-armed gorilla finally couldn't take it anymore. He roared and quickly retreated, disregarding everything else as he madly shot out of the civilized country. He was going to escape without a trace. Guai Shou saw him escape, but he didn't have the thought of letting him go. He chased after him without hesitation and didn't use any other methods. He brutally slammed into the gorilla again and again. The collision caused the six-armed gorilla's body to continuously spurt out blood, flesh, and broken bones, making him look like he was no longer a complete body. Instead, he gradually looked like a pile of minced meat, a pile of blood. They chased and fled like this. Unknowingly, they were already tens of billions of light years away from the civilized country. During this process, the six-armed gorilla's flesh and blood were left in almost every place. At this point, the six-armed gorilla's body finally couldn't be seen anymore. Stop! What on earth do you want? Finally, when Guai Shou slammed the six-armed gorilla's body to the point that it almost collapsed, the six-armed gorilla seized the opportunity and roared in anger. Guai Shou didn't care at all. He slammed into the gorilla again, once again pushing the six-armed gorilla into the abyss of destruction. At this time, the six-armed gorilla was extremely sullen and angry. In the previous collisions, he had used all kinds of methods, such as escaping, defending, resisting, counterattacking, and even summoning Mo Ming's power to form all kinds of defensive concepts to resist. However, in the end, Guai Shou could think of corresponding methods to offset his response. He slammed into the gorilla with his own body, directly pushing the gorilla into the abyss. The reason for this was not complicated at all. Guai Shou's strength was at the same level as the six-armed gorilla. Even if there was a gap, it was extremely small. In this way, all the defenses and attacks that the six-armed gorilla could think of, Guai Shou naturally had corresponding methods to offset them. And after all the defenses and attacks were offset, what was left was the most fundamental body. Thus, the current situation appeared. I admit defeat. As long as you stop, I will listen to everything you say. After hundreds of collisions, the six-armed gorilla finally couldn't stand it anymore and shouted. He couldn't help but shout. If this continued, he would die a violent death. Listen to everything I say? Guai Shou heard this and finally stopped. That's right. As long as you are willing to stop, I will listen to everything you say. At this time, how could the six-armed gorilla still care about his face? He said without hesitation. Hearing this, Guai Shou finally believed that he didn't mishear and said, "If that's the case, open your mind and let me leave a restriction." Leave a restriction? You must be joking. The six-armed gorilla was instantly enraged. In this world, there were indeed all kinds of methods that could restrict other creatures. However, it was usually the strong's control over the weak. With such control, the life and death of that creature would be in the hands of the controller. This situation was simply the biggest insult to the six-armed gorilla who controlled the second level of power in the Realm King's territory. How could he not be angry? In this rage, he roared. The destruction concept that was more powerful than all the destruction concepts he had used before fell from the sky, directly crushing toward Guai Shou. Guai Shou was already prepared. He also produced the nothingness concept and directly blocked the destruction concept. As for himself, without hesitation, he once again charged toward the six-armed gorilla, or in other words, the pile of minced meat. Chapter 1607. When Guai Shou heard this, he became vigilant and said, "Then what are you waiting for?" As he spoke, he was about to slam into the gorilla again. When the six-armed gorilla saw this, he did not dare to be careless. He quickly shouted, "I will open my soul now." As he spoke, his mind was naturally open, waiting for Guai Shou to put the restriction in it without any concealment. His attitude clearly showed that he had truly given in. After realizing this, how could Guai Shou be polite? With a thought, in an instant, countless powers gushed out of his body and evolved in the void, turning into the concept of nothingness. After a series of strange weaves, they formed tens of thousands of restrictions. They combined and fell into the six-armed gorilla's soul. They directly merged with his soul, causing his soul to be completely wrapped up by the restriction. There was not even a little gap. He was completely controlled by the restriction. The reason why he used this kind of power to transform the concept into a restriction was actually very simple. After all, the six-armed gorilla was a terrifying existence that was more powerful than ordinary desperators. Even Guai Shou and Luo Fan could not be sure what kind of abilities and methods such an existence had. Under such circumstances, in order to restrict the opponent, Guai Shou could only use all of his wind literature, all of his abilities, all of his methods, all of his inspiration, using his strongest method to restrain his opponent. This was to prevent the opponent from seizing the opportunity to escape. Of course, even so, he could not be sure that these methods could really restrict the opponent, but after all, this was already his best effort. Even if he could not succeed, he could only admit that he was not capable enough, but he would not feel regret or anything like that. The overlapping concept of nothingness directly restricted the six-armed gorilla's soul from top to bottom, making the six-armed gorilla feel an indescribable pressure in his heart. Moreover, this existence that looked similar to him, or even slightly inferior to him, seemed to have become countless times more powerful at this moment. Looking at him, he felt as if he was looking at his natural predator. In that instant, the six-armed gorilla understood that its life was in the hands of the other party. For the six-armed gorilla, this kind of control was nothing. It made him feel an indescribable sense of humiliation. It also made him feel relaxed. Humiliation. That was because he, who had always been high and mighty, and even viewed all living beings who were inferior to him as ants, actually had his life and death in the hands of an existence who was almost at the same level as him. And relaxed. It was much simpler. It was because he had already been restricted by his opponent. In this way, the person in front of him would naturally not attack him, and would not be as unreasonable as before, who would continuously collide with him, crush him and gradually turn him into minced meat. After completely restraining the six-armed gorilla, he sensed that its life force could be destroyed at any time, and he was more or less relieved. Of course, it was only a rough estimate. He was still vigilant in his heart. Although he had restricted his opponent, for such a powerful existence, he would not be surprised if there were any unknown methods that could resist this kind of restriction or even perish together with him. Under such circumstances, how could he be completely at ease? "Now, can you let me go?" the six-armed gorilla shouted. "From now on you must call me Lord," Guai Shou said faintly. Normally, the person who was restricted should call the person who released the restriction master. However, the difference in strength between the six-armed gorilla and Guai Shou was not big. If he forced it too far, it would directly fight to the death, and the threat to him would be too great. Therefore, he could only get rid of the title of Lord, and let it call him Lord. Master was how a slave addressed his master. On the other hand, Lord was how a servant addressed the master. The two seemed to only differ by one word, but in fact their statuses were worlds apart. No matter what, the six-armed gorilla had been pretending to be the king of humans in this human kingdom for a long time. Naturally, he was very clear about the difference in terms of address. When he heard Gui Shou asking him to call him Lord, an inexplicable sense of gratitude welled up in his heart. Humph! Of course, it did not show its gratitude on its face, and it only snorted coldly. Gui Shou did not take it too far. From its behavior, it knew that it had already agreed, and it did not pursue the matter of the other party, not addressing it as Lord on the spot. At that moment, it turned around with the six-armed gorilla, lifted its feet, and took a light step forward. Their figures constantly traversed through time and space, and in a short while, they had returned to the civilized kingdom, back to the place where he had disappeared. When it returned, the many creatures that were enlightened by Gui Shou, the creatures formed by the fate of the kingdom, and even the creatures in this civilized kingdom trembled at this moment. Obviously, they all recognized the identity of the six-armed gorilla and knew that it was the existence that had almost destroyed the entire civilized kingdom. However, they quickly regained their composure. After all, Gui Shou was right next to them. Just as Gui Shou had almost blind confidence in Luo Fan, these creatures also had almost blind confidence in Gui Shou. This confidence made them feel that as long as Gui Shou was around, no matter how dangerous things were, they would not be in any danger. In other words, no matter how dangerous the six-armed gorilla's original identity was, as long as Gui Shou was by their side, they did not think that it had the ability to destroy them. In particular, when they saw that Gui Shou did not seem to care about it, they were even more certain that the six-armed gorilla was not a threat to them. Gui Shou saw the reactions of the crowd. However, he did not show it on his face, and he only said faintly, "I will open a forum and preach. If you are fated, you can come and listen." These words were directly transmitted to the ears of every living being in this civilized country, making all living beings feel as if he was whispering these words into their ears. After saying this, Gui Shou did not hesitate. With a thought, he raised his hand and gently swiped in the void. In an instant, above normal spacetime, a strange existence appeared inexplicably under that inexplicable place. And in this strange existence, a strange island appeared out of thin air. Gui Shou had done this kind of thing tens of thousands of times. This kind of strange existence that was created at this time was naturally perfect. It had almost reached the limit that he could achieve. That perfect and mysterious island. It was a magnificent sight. Everything displayed exactly how profound and perfect the profundities of the grand Tao that Gui Shou grasped were. After the island was created, Gui Shou led everyone, including the six-armed gorilla, into the island and appeared on the square where he had prepared to preach. Just as they arrived, tens of millions of living beings who had cultivated the mimic divine mystique passed down by the six-armed gorilla appeared on the island and on the platform. These creatures were forcibly selected by the Gui Shou to listen to the Tao. Generally speaking, the Gui Shou didn't force living beings to listen to the Tao. It would usually set up a rule and let those living beings who met the rule choose for themselves. They could either listen to the Tao or give up on the opportunity. The reason why he used a different method to force these living beings to come here and listen to the Tao was rather simple. That was because the theurgy these creatures cultivated was constantly transferring the halo of the new protagonist of this civilized country to the six-armed gorilla. In other words, if these living beings didn't change to cultivate the theurgy that Luo Fan had specially created for them, even if the Gui Shou subdued those living beings and restrained the six-armed gorilla, the benefits to this civilized country wouldn't be as great as imagined. This civilized country was still suffering invisible damage, and the halo of the new protagonist of this world was still being taken away. That was why the Gui Shou had forcibly transferred these living beings here, so that they could come here even if they didn't want to. Most of those living beings wanted to listen to the Gui Shou's Tao preach here. However, with so many people, it was impossible for all living beings to have the same thought. In fact, there were also a large number of living beings who didn't want to come here for a moment. Those living beings were in an uproar. Some were happy and excited, and some were irritated. They felt as though they had been humiliated. After a long while, they gradually discovered the various mysteries around them. Only then did they gradually calm down. After waiting for them to calm down, the Gui Shou began to preach the mysteries of the true divine theurgy that he had specially asked Luo Fan to bestow upon him. As he spoke, the mysteries of the true divine theurgy began to unfold in front of the living beings like a scroll. For a moment, almost all of the living beings focused their minds on it. In the blink of an eye, those living beings with resentment no longer had any resentment in their hearts. Although these living beings had cultivated the theurgy that the six-armed gorilla had imparted to them, they had never received proper guidance. However, they had never received proper guidance after all. They knew about the divine ability but didn't know how to use it. Even if they managed to cultivate it, they still didn't know why they were able to cultivate it, the many key points of the divine ability, and the many difficulties. Under such circumstances, after listening to the Gui Shou's description of the theurgy that was comparable to the theurgy that they had painstakingly cultivated for countless years, they suddenly felt that all the difficulties and weaknesses that they had encountered in cultivating the theurgy in the past were suddenly solved. All the problems he had encountered in his cultivation in the past were constantly being answered during this process. As a result, these cultivators' cultivation realms began to improve without them realizing it. Auras of breakthroughs directly filled the square. So it's like this. When the Gui Shou finally finished explaining the theurgy, the same thought appeared in all of the living beings' minds. In the process of the Gui Shou's explanation of the true divine theurgy, these living beings' understanding of the theurgy that they had previously cultivated became deeper and deeper. When the true divine theurgy was completely explained, the living beings' understanding of the theurgy's essence had broken through a certain boundary. They finally understood the essence of the theurgy that they had previously cultivated. For a moment, the hearts of all the living beings were filled with lingering fear and regret. If the six-armed gorilla had appeared in front of them at this time, they might have directly pounced on it and fought it to the death. Immediately afterward, the square was filled with all kinds of strange sounds that were produced by the destruction of the theurgy. Powerful fluctuations of power surged out of the bodies of the living beings and began to wreak havoc on the square. This was the complete destruction of the powerful theurgy that all the living beings had cultivated for an unknown number of years. The fluctuations produced by the complete destruction of the enslavement seed that was condensed from the theurgy. After all, these living beings were all quite powerful. They were probably existences of the quasi-sage realm. With all kinds of powerful fluctuations seeping out of their bodies, the combined effect produced should have been earth-shattering. Not to mention the destruction of many worlds. The space-time within a radius of billions of miles was directly stirred up. There was absolutely no problem. However, here, on this island, the various terrifying fluctuations ultimately did not break through the square at all. All the fluctuations were limited to the square. Not to mention breaking through, they did not even affect any of the living beings on the square. It felt as if the square and the living beings were in a completely different space-time. No matter what happened between them, it would not affect anyone else. All kinds of fluctuations were born one after another, and they also disappeared one after another. After an unknown amount of time, all the fluctuations disappeared. All the living beings looked as if they had a serious illness. Their faces were pale and they were sweating profusely. It was obvious that their vitality was greatly damaged. After that, waves of fluctuations of power once again spread out from the bodies of the living beings. These fluctuations were no longer the fluctuations produced by the destruction of the theurgy. Instead, they were fluctuations produced by the condensation and transformation of power. They were fluctuations produced by the cultivation of the theurgy. It seemed that after the many living beings destroyed the theurgy they cultivated, they began to circulate their power again to cultivate the theurgy taught by Gui Shou. They began to diligently cultivate this theurgy in order to regain the fate Tao that had been stolen by the theurgy and the protagonist halo that had been stolen. There were good and bad aptitudes, strong and weak among these living beings. Some were extremely suitable for the theurgy taught by Guizhou. They very quickly grasped the theurgy and directly condensed a faintly discernible whirlpool in their bodies. After this whirlpool appeared, in the long river of fate that they could not perceive, a faintly discernible whirlpool naturally appeared in the corresponding fate Tao world. This whirlpool constantly spun, trying its best to pull in some kind of invisible and intangible existence, trying its best to collect and retrieve the existence that had been taken away from the long river of fate Tao. At this moment, an indescribable emptiness appeared in the hearts of the living beings that condensed this whirlpool. This emptiness was not the feeling that the whirlpool gave them. Instead, this whirlpool tore apart the fog that originally shrouded them, allowing them to find their true feelings. They found the indescribable emptiness that was originally concealed. For a moment, all the living beings that formed this whirlpool had ugly expressions on their faces, but they also rejoiced. The ugly thing was that this feeling of emptiness had been hidden for so long without them knowing. Fortunately, he had regained this feeling and found a way to deal with this emptiness. As more and more living beings cultivated this theurgy, these faintly discernible whirlpools naturally appeared in the long river of fate Tao more and more. The pulling force for something that they had lost together was also becoming stronger and stronger. In the end, after an unknown period of time, when all the living beings cultivated this theurgy and condensed the whirlpools in their bodies and the long river of fate Tao, the attraction force of the whirlpools finally broke through a certain limit. It directly attracted bits of incomparably wonderful halo fragments into the whirlpools, and they were then thrown to an extremely unfamiliar and special location in the fate Tao world. At this moment, the expression of the six-armed gorilla changed drastically, and a look of disbelief appeared in its eyes. How is this possible? How can the luck that was taken away be transferred back? At this time, he had a thought in his mind. At this moment, he was filled with disbelief. It should be noted that the theurgy that he passed on to others to seize fate Tao was not created by him. It was a theurgy that he had specially requested the realm emperor to create. This theurgy, even after studying it for such a long time, he was still completely confused. He could not figure out the principle behind it at all, nor could he figure out the weaknesses and advantages of this theurgy. Not to mention knowing clearly how to break this divine ability, and how to reverse the effects of this divine ability. But it was such a theurgy. It was actually in the hands of an existence that looked similar to him. It was so easily deciphered. She even created a theurgy that ordinary living beings could cultivate and reverse the effects of this theurgy. This was a huge blow to him. One could imagine. At this moment, the six-armed gorilla even doubted how much of the feeling that he had of being similar to his master was real, and how much of it was just an illusion. At this moment, Guizhou only had a faint smile on his face. He turned to look at Guiyun beside him and found that Guiyun's face was full of surprise. At the same time, waves of invisible nation fate began to slowly enter his body, causing his essence to become rather slow in the beginning. However, it was extremely stable, as if there was no hindrance in the process. How could Guizhou not understand such a process? It was clear that this civilized nation was gradually getting rid of the changes of that theurgy. It's finally solved. For a moment, such a thought flashed in his mind. Previously, although he had almost blind faith in Luo Fan, after all, the problem encountered by this civilized nation was something he had never thought about before. Even after receiving Luo Fan's explanation and the support of Luo Fan's theurgy, he still did not understand the situation of this nation. Under such circumstances, it was difficult for him to doubt that the theurgy that Luo Fan imparted could really solve this nation's problem so easily. With such doubts as a foundation, now that he found that the theurgy was working, it was obvious how he felt in his heart. While Guo Shou was preaching to the many creatures, the creatures in the civilized nation that were in line with the rules set by Guo Shou also arrived on this island one after another. However, it was just like what Guo Shou did to the creatures that he enlightened. The creatures that were forcibly transferred here by Guo Shou were completely beyond the vision of these creatures that came later and took the initiative to come here. In their eyes, they did not see the existence of those creatures at all. To these living beings who had come in search of opportunities, they only saw each other. They could not even hear the principles of the theurgy that Guo Shou had preached before. To them, this island was empty, and there were only all kinds of mysterious principles and mysterious Tao marks on the island. Of course, even these were enough for them to comprehend. It took those creatures tens of thousands of years to send the fragments of the protagonist's halo out. Now, if they wanted to get these halos back, even if the time needed was not as long as before, it could not be done in a short time. At least, it was not something that could be done in 1 or 2 years. Therefore, when Guo Shou saw that many creatures had begun to transfer the fragments of the protagonist's halo back using the theurgy that Luo Fan imparted, he no longer paid attention to them. With a thought, he directly appeared in front of the many cultivators that came here in search of opportunities and began to preach the path of cultivation to them from scratch, just like how he had done countless times in the territory of the big organizations.